Welcome to the DTN Ag Summit. I'm Farm Business Editor Katie Dellinger. I'll be your host for this event today. This is our second day of our DTN Ag Summit. Today we're going to be really focused on our outlook for 2025, what farmers, ranchers, producers out there really need to know as they're getting ready for the year ahead. So we're going to do a couple of housekeeping things here in the beginning to get it started. I want to let you know that I will be moderating all of the questions and answers today. So if you have any questions, please drop them below in that Q&A box that you see down below. We'll make sure to try and answer all of your questions either in that space or live as we discuss it with our experts today. We're going to start off our schedule with a conversation on the weather outlook for 2025. Then we'll move into the grain markets outlook. We're going to be doing a joint Q&A with our lead grain analyst, Rhett Montgomery, and our ag meteorologist, John Baranick. And then we'll take a little break and we'll bring in our livestock analyst, ShaLe Stewart, to talk a bit about what's going on in the cattle market. So now that we've got a little bit of the lay of the land for what to expect today, let's go ahead and get into it. I want to get started off with our first guest, introduce our first guest here in the studio, John Baranick, our DTN's ag meteorologist. John, welcome back.
Yeah, good to be back, Katie. It's always good to be back and kind of chat about the weather a little bit. So that, if you're a DTN subscriber, you see me kind of writing or spitting words at you, kind of talking with you a little bit about this is a little bit more fun. So I enjoy this a lot more. Even if we're not in person, it's still a good time to kind of chat about things a little bit more.
I think the interactive nature of these makes it so much more valuable than just reading an article on the outlook for a forecast or something. The way you explain it makes a lot of sense. Well, where it's like, for me, reading through a lot of science can get very difficult, or at least that's how I view a lot of meteorology. It's very science heavy for me, and I'm an economics nerd. So your nerd, my nerd, But let's go ahead and start off with it, John. Go ahead. Take it away.
Yeah, sure. We'll talk we're going to do things a little bit differently this time, and I'll kind of explain why. But we're going to get a little bit more nerdy, I guess, here, Katie. So we're going to talk about the typical things we talk about, where we're at, what's kind of driving the weather, and what the forecast is. But we're going to have a little bit more of an explainer this time around. So I just wanted to put this picture up. This is in my backyard this fall, so that was great. If anybody else got to see the auroras over this past year, they've been absolutely amazing. Side note to that. Anyway, but when we talk about what's been going on over the last couple of months here, I mean, temperatures have been really warm outside of what's happened over the last week since Thanksgiving, and we got that nice burst of cold Arctic air moving through. It was a very, very warm fall. If you add up every day from September 1st to November 30th, temperatures just blasted warm. Anytime we got a little hiccup to that, it was really brief and didn't last too long, not all that cold. So it was very warm. Also, most of this time it was pretty dry. We had a pretty wet end of the fall season, but especially early on in the fall, in September and most of October, we were very dry, and that really was kind of good and bad, right? We saw a drought increase across a lot of the country, but it was really easy to get crop out of the field. When we got into the later half of the fall season, though, we really started to change the weather pattern here, and we got really active across the middle of the country. You can see that bullseye of green there in the central and southern plains. That really just boosted soil moisture there for winter wheat. Those crop condition ratings soared from the crop progress report. We also had scattered good rainfall in parts of the southeast. Most of that, honestly, though, is due to Hurricane Helene. It was a little bit quieter outside of that. But, overall, it was kind of a weird mix of hot and dry to start, very wet in the middle of the country towards the end. And we've finally started to feel a little taste of winter here over the last week. As far as what that meant for the drought monitor, what we're showing here is on the left is the actual drought monitor for the latest one. Actually, this is not today's, or yesterday's one is from last week, but still pretty similar here. Lots of drought in the northern half of the country. Despite the good rainfall, we haven't been able to really translate that farther north. A lot of those livestock areas there around Wyoming and then along the Montana, North Dakota border area, they're still in some pretty significant deep drought. Also across far southern Texas into the southwest. But we were able to kind of eliminate a bunch of that there, and you can see that on the right where we've been at over the last 3 months. And the drought that was there in the southwestern plains is pretty much gone. And we went from a situation where we were really concerned about the soil moisture down there to not so much anymore. And we've been able to eliminate some of that drought around the Mississippi River, which has sort of helped with the water situation on the Mississippi. Also parts of the Ohio Valley too helping out as well there. But we still have kind of a background situation of we still have plenty of drought across a good portion of the country. And so when we look at soil moisture, this is the top soil moisture. All that rain there in the central and southern plains just shows up as a nice big blue bullseye. We got lots of good soil moisture there as the crop goes dormant. It's going to be a nice boost when springtime arrives, as long as we don't get too hot and dry over the winter and early spring. That should kind of sustain us for a little bit. But if you look around the rest of the country, there's plenty of browns and reds around. It's not that great. Topsoil moisture at this point in time is not a huge concern. We're looking at subsoil moisture a little bit more, and when we switch to that graphic here, it's not a whole lot different. But there's not a ton of spots out there that are just in really bad shape. The spots where we kind of match this up with the drought in Wyoming and eastern Montana and western North Dakota, that kind of sticks out. There's some areas there around the upper Midwest and into the Great Lakes areas that are a little on the drier side too, but we can get rid of that with some good snowpack and some good rainfall throughout the winter and early spring. So overall, not a huge deal at this point, although that is something in the background we're going to have to watch. Because if we don't get some good rainfall during that period of time, then we might have issues. So we'll keep our eyes on that. So now when we look at, what's going to really drive our weather here this winter, those 3 arrows are what we're looking at. I mean, there's all sorts of things that impact our weather and that we got to keep track of. I mean, they all have a certain time frame where they're important and when they change. All those ones in greens kind of change every few days or a week or two. The ones in yellow there are ones that last several months at a time before they change. And then the ones at the bottom in red are the ones that take years or many years to finally change over. And so all of these are really impactful for what is going to go on for our weather. And what we're going to focus in on here today is those 3 arrows there. Starting from the bottom, we're going to start with our ENSO. We always start with that because it is the biggest driver, especially during the winter season. So we'll be starting there. But the other 2 I want to kind of dive in a little bit too, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But the MJO, the Madden-Julian Oscillation there. That's just thunderstorms moving around the equator. That can have a big impact on our jet stream. We'll talk about that. And the other one there is the Arctic Oscillation or the polar vortex. And anytime we start talking about polar vortex, I know that's become over the last decade or two a pretty hot button topic to talk about, and it has a dramatic impact on what our weather is going to be. So we're going to take a look at that as well. So first, starting off with ENSO, we've been talking, I don't know how long now, about the coming La Nina that just has not shown up yet. It's been amazing how it just hasn't happened yet. But when we talk about La Nina, and we'll get a little bit into it in a second here, what does that mean? Well, we get, most of our weather moves from west to east across the United States. The same is true in the southern hemisphere, by the way, across Australia and, say, Argentina and Brazil. All the weather moves from west to east, but right at the equator, it actually moves east to west. It moves differently. And during La Nina, those winds around the equator are a little bit more enhanced than normal. So they push a lot of that warm surface water at the equator westward towards Australia and Indonesia and China. And it's replaced by some cooler water then off the coast of South America and Mexico. And, where that pool of warmer water is what we're most concerned about. Not necessarily how cold that water is around the equator, but where that warm water is. That's going to be the most important thing to watch for. And is it going to be in kind of the eastern or western portions of the Pacific? So going over the last year, I mean, we've gone from, those images on the right that are all in orange are showcasing the very strong El Nino we had last winter. We called it a super El Nino because it was historically strong at that point. And we trickled that down all the way into spring. And we've been hovering around neutral or just below neutral here. That black box on each of those indications are that area we look at to kind of formally tell us whether we're not in El Nino, La Nina or not. And we're at a minus 0.3, 0.5 would be the cutoff for La Nina. So we're not there. We're on the cool side of normal, but we're not quite at La Nina. And you can see on the right there where the arrow is, we've been kind of bouncing around right at the cusp of La Nina and not over the last several months, really. And it's really been kind of tied to kind of where that surface or that colder water is below the surface has just not come up to the surface just yet. If you look at the whole oceans as a whole, you can kind of see there our La Nina signature picking up a little bit just off the coast of South America, west towards the date line there. That's the dotted vertical line at 180 degrees west and east. There is some colder water poking up there right at the equator. It's not significant, really. It's kind of, like I said, it's on that cold side of neutral, but still technically neutral. But notice kind of on the western side there, where we've got some warmer waters just off the coast of Australia, off the coast, or in and amongst all those islands around Indonesia, and then off the coast of China as well. So we don't really have a strong La Nina signature, but we do have some very warm waters there that are indicative of what happens during La Nina in the Western Pacific. So that's going to be important. The other thing to notice might be the kind of warm waters just about everywhere around the world. I've been saying this all year, and it's kind of been one of the reasons why we've had such an active pattern here this year. It's not one area that's active, it's many areas across the world. So the Indian Ocean is very active, the North Pacific has been very active as well as the Atlantic. So we've had system after system kind of move through, and we haven't been able to be in a real stagnant pattern for very long throughout much of the year because of all of this. So that all has impact and importance as well. Back to the ENSO picture and the potential for La Nina. That red box there is where we kind of designate, are we in La Nina or not? And we're going down with depth through the ocean here, and we're taking a look at what those temperatures look like. And like we've seen ever since probably March, this pocket of cold water has just been lingering underneath the surface. And models keep trying to bring that up and saying we're going to be in La Nina, and it doesn't happen. It's just lingering just below the surface. But that's the important part. Whether or not it's 100 feet down doesn't really matter to the weather. It's not interacting with the air. So it needs to be right at the surface, and it just hasn't. Just off to the east, closer towards South America, it's pretty close. And again, if that water comes up to the surface, then we would be in a likely full-blown La Nina. But it just hasn't yet, and every time we look at it, it's been kind of holding back, we'll say. And this image from the model, from the American model, climate model, the CFS, has shown the same idea every single time here over the last, I would say probably 6 months. Wherever we're at right now, and you can see in October there, the black line stops, and then we get all these little model runs. It wants to dive us right down into La Nina immediately. It wants to bring that cold water right up to the surface. And it's been doing, if you look back a month ago, it did the same thing. 2 months ago, 4 months ago, it was doing the exact same thing. So it's really hard to trust this model, even though it's a really tight grouping there through the winter months that we're going to be in La Nina. Still can happen. And we're still expecting some sort of weak La Nina to occur, but not as intense as this model is suggesting. So when we look at some of the other models across the globe, from different outlets from Europe and Asia, a lot of these other models are saying, yeah, we might dip right below that blue line for a couple of months, but we come back up towards neutral. I think the important part is that, one, La Nina is not going to be strong. And even if it does, it'd be very, very short time period when that occurs. Two, we get back up to neutral for spring, so we don't have a big driver there either. So La Nina is not going to be the driver of weather here this year. This is just not going to be the one. And it's a little different when we look back at the last several years. I mean, it's been honestly a real easy job for me over the last few winters. We've had a big driver in the Pacific Ocean. If we, going back to 2020 into 2021, that winter, we had 3 straight winters of La Nina that occurred. Last year, we had that super El Nino that was the big driver. And this year, we've kind of, ho-hummed around neutral. So we don't have that big driver in the Pacific. So other things are going to be important. This is why I want to talk about some of the other things going forward. But, kind of as a historical kind of message here, this is not what I was expecting. I was expecting La Nina to be firmly in place by now. When we go to some of the historical records and we look at some of these super El Ninos that occurred, the year and second after that, the 2 years after that, fell into La Nina category on both of those years that followed a super El Nino. Not so much back in the 60s. That was a little different, and we don't have great data anyway. But, especially recently here over the last 40 years, every time we hit the super El Nino, you should expect a La Nina. And it just hasn't happened. It's been a kind of a little different this time of year. So we got to talk about some of the other things that are going on. And one of those we call the MJO, the Madden-Julian Oscillation. And it's just a pulse of thunderstorms that kind of are group thunderstorms that moves across the equator, west to east, all the way around and keeps going around. And kind of explaining what the mechanism that causes this. Have you seen a wave tank before? Have you gone to maybe a science museum, or maybe they show something on TV about a simulator for waves crashing into shore or something like that for hurricane stuff? You can do that by pushing water one way. It builds that up, and then you pull it back the other way, and it goes down. So you create this wave that propagates forward, and you have these ups and downs with it. Well, you can do that in the water, but you can also do that in the air. Air is a fluid, just like water is. It's a little different because you can't see it, but it behaves just like water does. So you can do the same thing where you get these waves to move through the atmosphere. And this is kind of what happens down around the equator. And this is here's where we get a little bit nerdy and we get a little bit sciencey, and we start to talk about, try to confuse you as much as possible. If you can see kind of where those thunderstorms are, and that red dotted line that's vertical, that's the crest of our wave, and it's pushing air upwards, and it creates those thunderstorms. And when that moves over areas of warm water, like we're seeing over the Western Pacific currently and in the Indian Ocean, we build thunderstorms there. And okay, so why do we care about that? Well, those thunderstorms add energy into the upper atmosphere. It goes into the jet stream. As you can see on the top of the image, hopefully that green arrow is, all that energy gets sucked into the jet stream, and it impacts, how that moves and where our big ridges and troughs end up across the world. And so when this moves across, of the ocean there, it can really impact how things are changing, especially when when the Pacific is not really a big driver of our weather this year. So you can kind of imagine one of these things moving through. It goes around the equator, it comes back, and we kind of start the process all over again. How long does it take? Well, the speed kind of varies, but anywhere from 30 to 60 days is pretty typical for one of these waves to make a complete circle around the Earth. And so every 30 or 60 days here, that's going to be kind of key in on that, because we'll talk about that in a bit. That's going to be kind of the time frame we're looking at for kind of major disruptions to our pattern going forward. And where is it now? Well, it's right where the warm water is. So all these, we're looking at a satellite image, that black box there around the eastern Indian Ocean over Indonesia there is showing the big bursts of clouds and rain, thunderstorms that are there. And we'll be watching that move slowly eastward here over the next couple of weeks. It'll be very important to our forecast going forward. Here again, trying to confuse you. But that black box is right over the eastern Indian Ocean and Indonesia. At the top of our map there is what we're currently at. and then we're looking at a forecast as we move down. I don't want to get into the details. Honestly, it took me months to understand what these images are actually showing. But notice how at the top we're going from an area where there's blue, that's upward motion, and where the thunderstorms are. Once we get down towards the end of December and especially into early January, we flip that around. So instead of the upward motion, we have downward motion. And we should expect a disruption to our weather pattern. This would be a colder setup because we're getting into kind of a warmer period now. We'll talk about that in a second. But we're getting into a little bit warmer period now where that MJO wave is in the Eastern Indian Ocean and Indonesia. At the end of December into January, we're expecting a major disruption to that, where we could be looking at another cold pocket move through during that time. So if it's right around Christmas, maybe we get a nice big storm, make it a white Christmas. Most likely it'll be a little bit after that and we get a cold shot into early January. The other thing to talk about is the polar vortex. So this is separate from the MJO, but really both of those have an influence on the polar vortex. Typically what we see during winter is we get this nice strong polar vortex, and it's really tens of thousands of feet in the air of air just circling around the North Pole. And when that polar vortex is strong, all that cold air that's underneath that is contained at the North Pole. We don't really get much of that Arctic air. We need some other disruption to do that. But we can get some of these things from ENSO, from the MJO, to kind of poke a little hole into that. And you can think of it as, if you've got a nice strong circle, polar vortex, and you put a little bit of pressure on one of those sides of it, you can start to split that into a couple of pieces. And that's what happens when we get one of these big polar vortex events. We get something to kind of move into that polar vortex to dislodge it, either push it off the pole or split it into a couple of pieces. And that's when we can, not always, sometimes it happens over Europe, sometimes it happens over Russia, sometimes it happens over North America. And we get these splits that will come southward through Canada and give us a long duration shot of cold air. Well, let's take a look at that. Currently here on the left is way up in the atmosphere. We're talking, 50 to 70,000 feet in the air of what's going on. Those blues are the polar vortex and where it's spinning. It's a little bit dislodged southward over northern Canada, but for the most part, it's fairly intact. But as we get into early January, here's where we're looking at. And you can see over Alaska, this big bulge of warmer temperatures, really. And that's going to be a kind of a push to nudge the polar vortex at least off of the pole, if not try to split that. We'll see how that all works out. Again, this is 4 weeks from now, so it's kind of a long ways away. But we could see a big disruption to the polar vortex around that time. Now, that does not mean that early January, this is what we're going to expect. This is what the weather's going to look like at the surface. To get that air to kind of move from 50,000 feet in the air down to the surface takes several weeks. So usually around 4 weeks after we see a disruption to the polar vortex, we'll get a cold burst somewhere farther south. So whether or not that's here in North America or if that's down in Russia or Europe, not sure at this time. But think about it again. So we've got an MJO wave moving through in about a month's time, several weeks, about 30 days. Another one, if we're on that 30-day track, we could line up with this polar vortex disruption as well, and that could lead us again early February as another disruption. But that's what it's going to take. Without La Nina really being in control, it's going to take these disruptions to really give us some active and interesting weather. We went through it just now with what's happened since Thanksgiving. Looks like we'll get it so that's the end of November. Looks like another one kind of end of December into early January, and then another one for probably early to mid-February for that. So count on that going forward. Well, at least that's what we're going for. Also, if we don't, these things like the MJO and the polar vortex, we don't have really good forecasts for those beyond about 4 or 5 weeks. So how do we look beyond that? Well, we got to go to history. So we're going to take a look back at October and I'll show you in a minute why. But if you remember October was just a very warm month, very easy to go out and work out in the fields. We didn't have really big disruptions in terms of cold. If you did, it last a couple of days, and that was it. Very warm period there. Does that have an impact going forward? Well, our long-range team took an interest in this and looked at La Nina years over the last 25 years and split them into two categories. One where October was warm and another where October was cold. And then they looked at, does that have an impact on what the winter looks like? So what these maps show here then is that on those warm side ones, which I have in the box, the December through February temperature profile was very warm east of the Rockies, and we had colder air on the Pacific coast. And so you kind of have this trough off the west and a ridge in the east providing this kind of pattern here that kept us warm. It was the exact opposite when Octobers were cold. Those winters were very cold across the middle of the country. So there's actually a really good correlation, not a causation. You got to remember that, just because history suggests this doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen, but it does give us a clue that we're more likely to be warm here over the winter than we are to be cold. And these disruptions that come through will happen. Obviously, it's going to get cold over the winter. It doesn't not get cold. But there are more likely to be these 5 to 10 day chunks of colder air that move through and kind of disrupt the pattern, where we should kind of be in this base state where we have a ridge in the east, stays warmer, and a trough in the west. Usually that means an active pattern, at least for the northern tier of the country. So you do the same thing, take a look at the precipitation now, and those blues are above normal precipitation, the greens are below normal. Bad color scheme from the government, but that's what you get from the government. So what you can see there is on the west coast, where we have that trough, increased precipitation for kind of the Pacific Northwest. It does bleed a little bit, although there's not a huge correlation across the northern tier of the country. So we might get a little bit more snowfall out of that, we'll see. And then drier across the southern tier of the country as well. And if you look at the other side, the colder side, it has actually a pretty good flip in that pattern too. Not 100% on the precipitation. Precipitation is always fickle anyway. But it does lead us to believe that this setup will be more common than normal. And so we might see some of these areas across the north that are dealing with drought have some better opportunity for building a little bit more snowpack, depending on the temperature, maybe a little bit more rainfall to help kind of get us out of that. We'll see. So let's put all of that together. Let's get to the meat and potatoes of what we are really concerned about. What's the winter look like? What's the spring look like for next year? And if you add up every day, December 1st, so we're already into it, December 1st through February 28th, we're expecting kind of this pattern to be more in place. This is our history that we talked about. This is those disruptions we talked about. This is models as well. And we've got this kind of ridge in the east preparing us for an overall warmer winter, cooler in the northwest and into northwest Canada a little bit. That area is also much wetter. We may see, okay precipitation across the north. We'll see on that. And then once you get into the Great Lakes, it usually gets a little bit better anyway. Some of these clippers that come down aren't so great for the northern plains, but they pick up a little bit of moisture and kind of help out those areas around the Great Lakes. A little bit more lake effect potential with some of those disruptions too. So let's break it down a little bit more month by month. December, we've had this kind of cold pocket here, but we're going to get into some warmer weather here starting this weekend. I'm in Omaha. I'm going to bring it with me back to Minnesota. I'm really excited about that. Get some 40s back up north. That'll be great. But we stay kind of in this general warmer pattern. We will get another disruption next week, that a couple of days of some colder air moving through, but nothing dramatic. Overall, we should stay warmer for the most part. We should get another disruption in early January. That's kind of what you're seeing in the Northwest. You get some cooler air there building up again in Western Canada and the Pacific Northwest that will leak through the rest of the country. But you take the month as a whole, it should end up on the warmer side. Same thing for February, although that might have that polar vortex disruption. It might be a little bit more intense, which is why we're a little bit colder there, kind of in the central of the middle of the country. This is also in, we use analog years, and one of those years was 2021, and February of 2021 was that big Arctic blast that froze Texas and broke their pipelines and everything, and it was huge political and mess and everything like that. So that's all factored into it as well. But February is always usually a good time to get a polar vortex disruption, and the models seem to be thinking that this is probably going to be the case again this year. Also very typical during La Niñas to have a cold February. So we've got that in place. The precipitation outlook does lead to a drier southern tier of the country. So those areas that do have some good soil moisture at the moment might not have those good winter rains and snows to kind of help maintain that. So that might be a little unfortunate. We'll keep our eye on that specifically. But across the north, we might end up with some okay rain and snow. Snow's always a hard thing to forecast because it all depends on the temperature at the time the snow falls. I mean, you can have 1 inch of rain that turns to snow, and if it's warm, it's 6 inches of snow, and if it's really cold, it could be 25 inches of snow. So trying to predict snowfall patterns is next to impossible, but our long-range team does believe that the northern tier of the country, because we have a better opportunity of producing precipitation, should have above normal snowfall and snowpack. That includes up into the Canadian prairies as well. So hopefully we'll get that to kind of ease our drought concerns. So our main takeaways, we still have lots of areas of drought across the U.S. La Niña is sort of in control, but it really isn't. So it's really going to be these disruptions to the pattern that should set up where we have this trough in the west and ridge in the east. That should be kind of our general baseline state for the winter season. But the MJO and the polar vortex are going to play major roles this year in what this is going to turn out to be. And we're expecting some of those bursts to be intense, but only last 5 to 10 days or so at a time. So we'll get a couple of them, but expecting it in a big cold winter is not really in the cards. Overall, we should be warmer and drier for most areas, and the better chance of wetter kind of around the Great Lakes and maybe across the northern plains and Canadian prairies, especially the Pacific Northwest. That's winter. That takes us through that. I know I've been talking a lot, but we got to get into planting season, right? I think you're more concerned about what's going to happen here for planting than what's going to happen over the winter. That kind of sets us up for this. And really, spring is kind of a continuation pattern of the winter season. We don't have, we're expecting, if La Niña even occurs, expecting it to stay kind of in that neutral camp all the way through springtime. So that's not going to be the big driver. The big driver, again, is how long is that polar vortex going to stick around? Usually that dissipates sometime in April, and it's no longer a factor. Does it still hold power going later into the season? During La Niña, sometimes it does, and so that could be an issue. And the MJO and some other things that we won't even talk about here, but there's other things that will definitely play into this. And so what does the pattern look like here? Month by month, let's go through it a little bit more intensely. March, April, May, still kind of going with that, though our confidence is much lower here, of that kind of eastern ridge and western trough continuing through the fall or through the spring season there. These disruptions that happen are potentially going to be continuing well into our spring season. So could we get a big Arctic burst in April? Are we going to see some really cold temperatures lingering into May? We definitely could see that. That's kind of been the trend over the last 20 years is winter's kind of lasted a little bit longer. We've kind of moved it from December to March into kind of a January to April kind of business. So we've kind of shifted that a little bit. You can call that climate change. You can call that just, what's been going on. But that's kind of been the trend, is that we kind of are slower to start for winter and kind of linger that a little bit longer. So maybe that's the case again this year. In terms of precipitation, we have a pretty active March across the northern tier of the country. This is kind of split into two categories. Honestly, history kind of shows us that that the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley are favored, and models kind of like the whole northern tier of the country to be above normal. So we kind of blended that together, and that kind of gives us our wet March across the north. My guess is one of the two will win out, and we'll just have to see which one. Is it going to be the Ohio Valley area, or is it going to be the Northern Plains? And that's all really going to come down to timing, I think. I would suggest, based on how that temperature map looks like for March, that the Northern Plains and the Canadian Prairies would be kind of an area where I would see or tend to see more large systems bringing a big-time precipitation events. But we'll see how that all plays out. Again, low confidence forecast as we go into the spring season. So main takeaways, La Nina is if it occurs, it will be no longer in control, and the pattern's probably going to be pretty variable. It really depends on the length of the polar vortex influence, whatever happens with the MJO. Is it going to be strong MJO movement? Is it going to be weak and not have much of a factor? Overall, though, it still looks warmer and drier across the south and potentially colder and likely wetter across the north. So some of these areas that are dealing with drought across the north, again, this does look kind of more favorable than we might suggest earlier as to what might be going on, helping out with building soil moisture, preparing us for spring planting, but also, is it going to be too wet and cold there? Are we going to get a little bit of delays? Are we going to have some late frosts? That's also on the table as well. So we're going to have to keep a close eye on that. And again, low confidence forecast at this point. And, it's really interesting when we talk about how DTN puts together the forecast. This is kind of a thing of everything. Our actual forecast is there on the left, and kind of we have different probabilities of things going on. If the MJO is stronger, if the polar vortex is weaker, what happens? And in the middle is kind of those. But really, it's that box there on the right that we're looking at, those analog years we're looking at, and the models and history. And what, you blend the two together to get what's on the right. When they match up, that's great. It gives us a little bit more confidence. But, if you kind of look at those maps there between the two, I mean, there's some areas where they agree. There's some areas where there's massive disagreement. So this is why our forecast is a little bit more on the lower side of confidence here going forward this year. And honestly, it's just due to the Pacific not having a strong say in what's going on. So we're going to have to pay attention to what's going on over the next several weeks. We'll have, with the MJO and the polar vortex forecast, we get about a month of it in advance of some warning of somewhere these disruptions may occur. But going beyond that, it's going to be real difficult to do. We don't have a whole lot of good thing. And, then what's the summer going to look like? If our confidence is pretty low during springtime, it's almost a crapshoot talking about what's going to happen during the summer season. So while this says pretty warm and relatively dry, I mean, honestly, this kind of just matches our analog years that kind of favored this La Nina occurring, and kind of they lingered around into spring. This one's not going to do it. So this forecast kind of matches a lot what happened in 21 and 22 with those La Ninas. Those are both factored in, and those, if people can recall, across the Western Corn Belt was pretty warm and relatively dry. So that's kind of factored in here. So take this what you want. I probably shouldn't even put it on here, but I wanted to get a look at the whole season, but I just want to kind of reiterate here the summer forecast. No confidence whatsoever. I could easily see it going the other way. Now, Rhett's going to talk about markets, and a lot of that is due to the grain supply. We've had a really good year up here in the U.S., but they're having some really good weather down in South America for corn and soybeans as well. La Nina has been a delay up here, but it's also had delayed effects down in South America. And in South America, usually we end up with some dry conditions across Argentina and southern Brazil especially. But that's really not been the case outside of a really late start to the wet season in central Brazil, which was about 2 weeks late. That's significant. But since then, it's been really good. I mean, temperatures have been warm, and they haven't had a whole lot of cold air, which is somewhat concerning. But you look at the precipitation map, and this is just over the last 60 days, so it doesn't include that really dry September. But since that wet season started in central Brazil, the big green spots there right in the middle of Brazil. Argentina's been mostly wet, and it's been drier in southern Brazil, but honestly, it's not a huge concern. When we look at soil moisture maps, then it's no surprise then that Argentina has a couple of little dry patches there. In some spots, they're key spots though. It's something to keep in mind. And I had a blog yesterday kind of talking about some of this. So if you want to take a look at that on dtnpf.com, you're more than welcome to do so. But if you look at soil moisture there in Argentina, overall we're pretty close to normal. It's if we end up with some drier spots, drier forecast going forward, that would be a concern. But they're good right now. It's no surprise that we've got some pretty good predictions for production down there in Argentina here this year. Same goes for Brazil. There's a small patch there in kind of south central Brazil. You see those couple of green patches right there in the middle of the country. Those are the key areas right there, Mato Grosso, Goiás. Those are the key spots there for soybean production where they're in right now. Just south of that, it is a little bit drier in there, but honestly, next week they're going to get like 3 or 4 inches of rain, so they're not too concerned about it. They've been able to build back that soil moisture after that really dry start. And you can see that in kind of the crop health. So this is NDVI, normalized difference, vegetation index. I always get that name wrong, so if I screwed it up, I'm sorry. But it's kind of an indication of how green the leaves are down there. So if it's green on the map, it means they're in good shape right now. It's comparing it to normal, so it's not overall health. But you see some spots there in Argentina. There are some spots there where they got a little bit behind in their planting. There were some dry periods there. While the soil moisture may be good right now, it's not great. It's not perfect. It's not where they really want it to be. So there are some holes in there. When you look at Brazil, it's really kind of hard to find some of those patches. Where it's gray there in the middle of the country is just because there's so many clouds that satellite can't see the crops at all. So it turns out to be gray on that map, which is just an indication that it was been raining there and crop health is probably pretty good anyway. So it's even that dry spot in south central Brazil that's popping up has green all over it. So they've got some really good conditions right now. And it's going to take something big to kind of move that. But luckily, our forecast has some indications that we might be dealing with some hazardous weather coming up here in both countries. So this is kind of spread out through the whole summer season. So soybeans in central Brazil are going to be starting to fill here. Some of the early planted stuff is starting to fill their pods. But the main period here will be later this month and into January for filling on those soybeans. We got a dry period here coming up this month, and then it does look like in January we might get another one as well. So we're going to be paying very close attention to that. It looks really, really red there, but this is an anomaly. When you're talking about rainfall in central Brazil, they normally get 8 to 12 inches of rain every month in central Brazil. So if they only have half that, if they're dealing with 4 inches or 4 to 6 inches of rain for filling their soybeans, honestly, that's probably okay. The concern there for central Brazil is really that safrinha, that second season corn crop, not having enough moisture to kind of sustain them for the rest of the season. That's where we're really going to be concerned with, not so much the soybeans going on right now. It's going to be hard to really find a big concern weather-wise for them in Brazil for that. But it's that safrinha corn crop that we're really going to be concerned about. Is that going to turn out to be okay? And I don't know if Rhett's going to talk about it, but they were concerned about prices and planting and production being down a little bit anyway for safrinha corn. So we'll see if that's kind of a player there too. If the weather's bad and their planting's down, that may give us reason to be a little bit hopeful on prices. But it's all dependent on, does that actually show up? Argentina, same idea. They're a little bit more on edge with the soil moisture than they are in Brazil. So we're a little bit more interested in that kind of drier patch showing up there. If it does, they've got a really long growing season. So if it's drier over that whole season, that's really what we're looking at, because that would be the big concern. If it's a dry patch here, a week there, that can be spread out over the long kind of growing period. and not have a big effect. But if it's kind of a long sustained period of dryness, and that does seem to be kind of in the cards here. They've got a front going through Argentina right now, but behind that, for the next couple of weeks, it's going to be hard to get precipitation in Argentina. So does that continue? Does that show up for January and February when we're really making some ground on those corn and soybeans down there in Argentina? We'll see, but that's kind of what we're looking at. Same thing happens with the fall. We've got the same idea. This is their safrinha corn season in Brazil, and we have a drier patch there in central Brazil. That could be a very big impact for them if that wet season does end early. And during La Niñas, it is more prone to do that. So this shouldn't be very surprising for that. I think I've been talking about this for about a year now, that we're going to be a little bit concerned about that for going forward. But it's all speculation. The weather's been really, really good so far, and does this have a huge impact on their production down there? We're going to hope so, because that'll help out our prices, but it may be tough to do. So we'll see. That's all I've got for it, Katie. It's interesting this year, and I'm sorry to everybody if I was a little bit more on the explanatory kind of education side of everything instead of just diving into the forecast. But I think this year it was a little bit more necessary just because we don't have that big driver like we've had the last 4 years.
I agree, John. I think it was really good to go through a lot of that additional educational things, especially since we're dealing with such a different environment for the weather, for the drivers, that we've been so used to La Nina, El Nino for so long that that's all there is, that to not really have much of a driver and knowing what some of these other things is, it's interesting and it's good to know. It's maybe on that 1 month cycle instead of this having a driver that's in place for several months at a time telling us where it's going.
Yeah, and like I said, the last few years, honestly, kind of easy to give us at least a base set, build our confidence for what the forecast was going to be. It might not have been perfect those last few years, but our confidence was pretty high in it just because that was a driver. Without it this year, our confidence just goes down the tank. And if you see some forecasts out there now, and I'm sure you're going to see seasonal forecasts from almost different sources, and they'll probably range from really hot and really dry in your area to really cold and really wet, and some mix in between. Honestly, you could mark any one of those, and if they turn out to be right, good for them. But any sort of confidence in those kind of forecasts are going to be pretty low this year.
Well, I see we've got a lot of questions for you in the Q&A. Please keep dropping those in there if you have them for John. We're going to take a quick break here, bring on Rhett Montgomery into our studio. He's going to give his presentation on the grain outlook, and then we're going to bring John back with Rhett to have a longer conversation about the weather and markets. So if you have questions, please drop them in that Q&A. We'll get to that after we get into our grain market outlook. So go ahead and grab a cup of coffee. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the DTN Ag Summit. I'm Farm Business Editor Katie Dellinger. I'm your host for the day, guiding you through this conversation on the new year, the new administration, and whether or not that means something new for the markets. I've got our new lead analyst, Rhett Montgomery, in the studio with me today. Rhett, welcome to our studio and your first DTN Ag Summit.
Thank you, Katie. It's good to be here. Good to be a part of DTN and excited to be a part of my first Ag Summit.
We're really excited to have you on the team, Rhett. You've been with us for a couple months now. I don't know how much all of our readers and viewers have learned about you over the past couple months. You want to tell us a little bit about your background and sort of what brought you into the DTN, into DTN's market philosophy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up on a farm in central Nebraska, got my degree in ag economics from the University of Nebraska, currently working towards my master's in ag economics from Virginia Tech. That's an online program. I spent most of my career as a grain merchandiser in central Nebraska out of Kearney, Nebraska, so just east of where I grew up. My wife and I had the opportunity this summer to move down to Norman, Oklahoma, where she's getting her PhD in history from the university down there. So we decided to take a chance and move down there. Unfortunately couldn't stay on with my previous employer, but really excited with the opportunity to join DTN. It allows me to stay involved in the markets from I was a little nervous about that. Moving down to Oklahoma, you're kind of getting out of grain territory. So to find this opportunity to stay in touch with the markets that are really my passion was really a blessing.
And with DTN, we are very deep into our cash grain data, and the cash grain world is part of our marketing and analysis. And I think having a hand in that's probably helpful with some of the tools and things that we do here at DTN.
Yes, absolutely. And I've really been, it seems like every day I find something in DTN's, cash data through ProfitX and all the data that's on hand. There's really just limitless possibilities for analysis. It's really a grain analyst's dream to be a part of DTN and have access to the systems that have been such a staple in agriculture now for several years.
Well, I think we are all really interested in hearing what you've got to say about the grain markets, what's going on in corn and soybeans and wheat. So I'll just go ahead and hand it over to you and let you take over.
Absolutely. Sounds great, Katie.
Great.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Rhett.
Yeah, so when looking at the markets this year, the motto I've been going with thus far is, it's really a case of big supplies versus big demand. And as we get here farther into, the stretch of 2024 and into 2025, it's really going to be an arm wrestle to see what side of that equation wins out. Jumping in, just beginning with some outside market themes to keep an eye on here. Anyone watching the markets, I'm sure, has been aware of the U.S. dollar index. Recently set two-year highs. It had been climbing through fall, but post-election in early November, it really took off to the higher as investors rushed in from around the globe to own investments in U.S. currency. It's worth noting it has relaxed here in the recent weeks as U.S. inflationary concerns have eased. Most of the key metrics that the Fed goes off of for interest rate decisions came in. Some came in slightly above last year, but they were all within expectations. So it's really setting the Fed up to likely cut their target rate again here in the mid-December meeting after, like I said, the October data met expectations for that. Also, U.S. financial markets continue to surge higher. The S&P 500 hit a new record earlier this week. I haven't checked it today, but I'm sure it's hanging up around there as well. So overall, a strong kind of flavor to the U.S. economy in general, which it can be mixed in terms of the correlations with grain prices, but usually I tend to believe a strong economy in the U.S. tends to be good for everybody, and grains are no exception to that. So the break in the U.S. dollar, strong equities have helped prop up grain prices here in recent sessions. Jumping into corn, this first slide just want to kind of put corn prices in perspective to where we've been currently. Looking back, you can obviously see the stable period going back to 2014 to 2020. Tended to have a prevailing range of around 330 to 430 in that market. What I did here was just adjusted that range by inflation. Those are the green bars on the chart. So as you can see on the front month corn futures here, that new range it's tending so far to hold true. We did dip just slightly below it here early ahead of this harvest when we were penciling obviously much larger production than we even are now. But it seems that bottom range is holding true for now. It's also worth noting on this chart that this is a weekly chart, and the last weeks have bumped above that 50-week moving average for the first time going back to 2022. So corn prices are making impressive technical headway right now, especially in the face of, like I said, demand has shrunk from what we thought it would be in August, but it's still, as we'll get into, a very large crop, at least on the U.S. side of things. So impressive technical headway being made by the corn market here. And we'll see moving forward if it can get a foothold that 50-week moving average might open up the market to something higher if it can get the fundamentals backing to get traders lined up on that side of the buy side of the market. Here I just wanted to kind of put a wrap on 2024 corn production. A lot of speculation this time of year goes into what the USDA is going to have to say about production in the January report. The January report obviously is their last official yield estimate. It's kind of a misleading term in my opinion, because they'll keep adjusting these production numbers down the curve if they feel they got something wrong. But it is worth noting the November and December WASDEs carry plus or minus 2.3% error in the 90th percent confidence range. So basically we can say with 90% confidence, so on a college scale, A minus grade, that 2024 corn production will land somewhere between 14.8 billion bushels and 15.5 billion bushels. So obviously not a small range. There's still, some big swings that can happen there. But the thing I'm focusing on mainly is, if we get the bump higher, we could potentially be looking at a record. We're currently sitting with the third largest crop on record. But in terms of cuts, the market seems to right now be favoring that they'll continue to cut production. Small crops get smaller is the old adage. That's, and looking at the research isn't necessarily true. But anyway, even if they do, within 90% confidence, you're looking at, the fourth largest crop on record. The real surplus issue here is, as it stands, the previous 5 years have featured 3 of the largest U.S. corn crops on record. So when you start piling those record and top 5 crops on each other, that's where you really start getting into the surplus years that we saw, back in 2014, 2020, the range on the previous slide, and feels like we're maybe getting back into a surplus and hopefully stable price era for corn. But looking at the other side, demand is also very strong. As it stands, out of the previous 5 years, 4 of the previous 5 years have featured the most corn demand, looking at U.S. corn. So this year it's currently estimated at 14.99 bushels, so just under 15 billion bushels. You can see it's really leveled out over the last few years, but a nice recovery from the difficult year, 2 or 3 years ago. And overall, it seems that corn demand kind of goes as corn production goes. Corn production equals cheaper prices, which equals strong demand. So it's a good thing to see this side of the equation keeping pace. It helps keep the carryout at a manageable level. Back under 2 billion bushels here through the fall. So that is definitely supportive to corn prices, which if we were over 2 billion bushels would be needing to head lower from where we're at today, definitely. Diving deeper into the demand equation on corn, really exports and the export book tends to make or break the demand picture for the U.S. corn balance sheet. Ethanol, feed usage, there's fluctuations there, but they tend to be much more stable than the world market, understandably. So, I think I can't remember the exact number, but in the December WASDE, the export number carries like a 28% margin of error, so compared to that 3% we were looking at on the couple slides ago. So a lot more leeway there, and a lot, so obviously several months to go on this export program to see where we end up. But currently, it's off to a very good start. Commitments are running 33% of the ahead of 2023. The USDA is currently only penciling about a 3% increase in exports. So that chart on the screen, it's worth noting, is just shipments. If you factor in the sales, that graph obviously jumps quite a bit. And history shows that the sales made through about January, February tend to make up about 60%, 70% plus of the yearly export book. So it's very important to grains that they make, get good business and make headway right now while U.S. corn prices are very competitive within the world stage to drive that export program higher. But as you can see, the shipment, the slope of that line is really intriguing. March to May, it really shoots up. So that's the period that the USDA tends to watch. They like to see sales turn into shipments, which is why I think we've seen them slow play, revising their demand figure, or their export demand figure, higher thus far and through the fall WASDEs is they want to see shipments, and right now shipments are strong, but it's just at this point it's a hard thing to guess looking at shipments this early when the majority of them, like I said, come in that March to May period. Jumping over to ethanol, like I said earlier, it's typically stable, but there is some bushels of demand to be found here. Looking at ethanol production thus far in the marketing year, we really had a strong October and most of November until last week. The Thanksgiving week, we saw quite a dip there in weekly ethanol production after setting 2 records in the previous 3 weeks for ethanol production in the United States. So it's not uncommon to see ethanol production, if you look back several years, for it to take a little bit of a breather on Thanksgiving week. So I don't think that's any reason for concern. It is worth noting, putting this all into a model, which it's not a fancy model by any means, but my current estimate just on pace thus far and the Energy Information Administration's last Friday released their September corn grind for biofuels, and it was well above last September. And September, typically isn't a huge needle moving month for corn grind, as a lot of plants tend to take downtime ahead of harvest. So seeing a strong September like that, I think it's really kicked off the corn grind for ethanol market here going into 2025. So I'm using a number of 5.53 billion, which would be very strong. It wouldn't quite be a record, but would be a good thing. And like I said, in a year with surpluses, every little bit of demand you can find can help. But we're obviously still early. I don't expect the USDA to, acknowledge that number per se. So especially, in next week's report, we'll probably see them slow play that just with how early we are. But it is worth keeping an eye on. Looking at corn basis, or how that demand translates into a corn basis, and I apologize, I should have stretched my y-axis on this graph a little bit to highlight the changes. But as you can see, the red line is current year corn basis through the fall. We really saw a strong move in basis through harvest, about halved it from an average of about 32 under the December board to at its tightest was about 16 cents under the board. As you can see, as we rolled bids from the December to the March board, we saw a slight backup in the basis. I would think with how demand is going, the market might be quick to absorb it. It rolled off at about an 8-cent spread. So really not a huge spread for the corn buyers out there to absorb if this demand keeps up. But for now, we have seen a little bit of a backup in bids there, even with that spread. So no cash appreciation is basically what I'm getting at yet. But like I said, we'll keep an eye on that. But thus far, basis over the 10-year period, right in the middle of the average, but firming here through fall as corn demand has remained very strong. Jumping over to the world equation for corn, obviously what's on everyone's mind right now, the trade in particular, is Brazil and Argentina's combined corn production is slated to be a record. It'll be, right now Brazil, the USDA is estimating to be right about 5 billion bushel corn crop, which would be their second largest if true. Argentinian corn about just over 2 billion bushels, and that'd be kind of a middling number for Argentina. But looking at South America combined and including the U.S. is where it really gets interesting. Adding the U.S., Brazil, and Argentina together accounts for about 60% of world corn production, not including China. We don't include China because they tend to be a closed system. They produce a lot of corn, but they use it all domestically. So that really puts it in perspective. Going into 2025, that by about April, May, we're really going to be know where the majority of the corn crop is. Obviously, we have the U.S. Part of the equation more or less figured at this point, as talked about earlier. As for Argentina will be the next one up. We should know by January, February how their crop is sitting with a lot of confidence, and then Obviously, the Brazilian second crop, the safrinha crop, is the last to come off in the May time period. So it gives us a good chunk of info, and it'll be steady info into 2025. But as things stand now, with as John talked about, pretty harmless weather thus far in South America, not expecting the USDA to really make any changes to this next week. Expect them to slow play that into 2025, but something to keep an eye on. Jumping to world corn demand, you're really looking at U.S. corn demand in particular in the world market. You can't talk about it right now without talking about Mexico. Mexico has really helped soften the blow from China completely disappearing from U.S. corn market. U.S. corn exports to China are down like 86% last time I checked from their peak in the 2021 year. So Mexico, in the meantime, has really ramped up their imports as they've had some production problems, some drought issues of their own. Currently, as the book stands, about 41% of U.S. corn commitments for this year are slated to go to Mexico. So this really puts into light, especially with the recent comments from, President-elect Donald Trump regarding, a 25% tariff on Mexico and their threats back of retaliatory tariffs, really stands to hurt the U.S. export book if they were to target corn. In those regards, it's difficult right now to figure where that would land. We need more economics behind it, specifically what percent would they tariff U.S. corn, what's Mexico's ability to get their corn needs from Brazil or another source. So it's still early in that discussion, but it is something to keep an eye on. And you can see from that chart that very reliant right now on Mexico for corn demand, just and have the geographical advantage of where we are to be that supplier. Kind of wrapping it up for corn, just wanted to give some ideas of what we might see for corn prices here. As you can see, this is just kind of a repeat of that first graph where we've kind of poked above that 50-week moving average. It's worth noting this level we're at has been kind of resistance, but I think if we can hold a footing above this and get some fundamental backing, specifically in the way of a shrinking, ending stocks number, could open up the market to return back to, the 460, 470s area, I think is about as bullish as I'm willing to get right now, just given where production and supplies are at. Beyond that, the upper bound of that range we talked about would be 525, but that would need significant fundamental support probably in the form of a weather event in South America, a drop in their production potential. Otherwise, if we continue to see weather go the way it has, and we do have those big crops out of South America, I see the downside risk really limited to about $4, and below that, the 2 standard deviations away from the current average would be 388. So it seems like thus far, whenever the corn market tries to challenge that $4 level, it's been very supportive. There's a psychological significance to that level with traders. You get too far below $4, you're really penciling in something pretty bearish. And given just where we are in the last if inflation in the last several years, I just don't see corn prices dipping back to like a 2020 type black swan event. And I think that 2020 year, looking back at the chart, it specifically has a lot of support. So that's kind of how I see it right now. I see there is downside risk, but I see it limited, and I also see our upside potential capped just with the supplies we're looking at. Jumping into beans now. Soybeans, kind of the same thing here. Tried to just adjust that stable range for inflation. As you can see, it's not quite as convincing as the corn chart. It seems to have, dipped below that and pulled back, and now we're kind of back into that, the upper bounds of that range we were in, for those years, from 2014 to 2020. But it'll be interesting to see here moving forward. it's going to be largely dependent again on South America. But if we can get a footing above that, the bottom green channel there, perhaps we'll have a chance maybe to revert back to the mean there on that chart, which is the red line is the 50-week moving average on this chart. Same thing for soybean production. A slightly larger margin of error in the November and December WASDEs from the USDA. Currently, with 90% confidence, you can say that you would expect 2024 soybean production to reach its final number somewhere between 4.3 billion bushels and 4.6 billion bushels. So a little tighter range, but obviously working with smaller bushels to begin with. So, every bit is felt a little more in the bean market. Looking at where we're currently at, the November report was the largest single drop of yield for a November WASDE on record. So that dropped we were sitting with a record estimate that's dropped us down to the second largest. So it's kind of the same situation as corn. We can say with pretty, good certainty that we're going to be somewhere between the fourth largest and a record soybean production in 2024. But it'll like I said, kind of all the traders in the market are kind of leaning towards future cuts, but we'll see how the USDA decides to handle that once we get to the January WASDE. Looking at supplies here, South America and United States, this one's a lot more front-loaded than the corn situation. Over 50% of the world's soybean supplies are determined by Brazil and Argentina. It's really an astounding number when you add the U.S. into that. It's over 80% of world soybean production. That's going to be largely known here by February, March. If we don't get a weather issue sometime in January or February, likely looking at a record crop in Brazil and a very good crop in Argentina, and obviously a very good crop in the U.S. So certainly, as we stand now, not a lot of supply issues on the soybean side of the things, definitely. And as you can see, the world soybean market definitely tends to go as these three countries go. Looking at Brazil a little closer, Brazil obviously has just really impressively taken over world export share of soybeans. You can see, going back 20 years, at one point it was the U.S. was about, a 55 to 60% share, and Brazil had about a 30% share. That situation is completely flipped to where now they control about, upwards of 60% of world soybean exports, while the U.S. is currently in the 20 to 30 range. My big question here moving forward is, with the surging in world soybean demand, especially on the tails of the biofuel race that we're seeing currently in the market, can the world soybean market afford a situation where these powers slip below a 30% share? As you can see, especially back in the early 2020s, years where there's any kind of production hiccup, you saw that number swing drastically. So the U.S. is definitely still on deck for a share of soybean exports should there be any kind of production issue. So I think while this chart is pretty discouraging perhaps to some people in the U.S., I think it's worth noting that the U.S. has very strong domestic demand for soybeans that's helped keep the carryout for domestic beans, relatively tight through 22, 23, and it's just recently now started to expand back towards the half billion mark, currently at 470 million bushels. But it'll be an interesting chart to look out for to see if like I said, can we really afford for the second largest grower of soybeans in the U.S. to take less of a 30% share of world exports with the demand situation for world soybeans continuing to rise. Looking closer at U.S. soybean export book thus far, we started off, we kind of had a slow start, but we've since, really taken off on 2024, 2025 pace. As you can see, it's well above, 2023's mark on shipments thus far. Shipments alone are about 19% above 2023. Penciling commitments were about 12%, and the USDA is running at about an 8% estimated increase in exports year over year. So as you can see, I really like to pay attention to the slopes on these charts. You get to February, March, and that slope on the black line really levels off. So back to what I said on corn, it's really important that the U.S. export book for soybeans makes ground early in this marketing season, because history has shown that once the South American crops are available, the U.S. tends to lose business in a hurry to the cheaper available Brazilian beans. Looking at the crush market, currently USDA is penciling in a record crush number. It's been a market that's steadily increased year in and year out. Looking at crush margins, we did see a slight decrease in crush margin here through November, specifically due to soybean oil's sharp sell-off. But that being said, there's still $1.85 per bushel margin for crushers. So still a lot of economic incentive for crushers to crush a lot of beans, which we saw, with the October crush number being a record, 215 million bushel crush in November reported by the USDA last week. So it continues to be strong source of demand for U.S. beans here moving forward, and I expect that to continue here into 2025. Looking closer at that record, like I said, just under 216 million bushels of beans crushed in October. The interesting thing is, despite this, soybean oil stocks are remaining historically low, which is just a testament to the newfound demand for soybean oil. It's really, no longer the byproduct of the crush industry, so to say. It used to be the beans were crushed for the meal, and the oil was kind of the side product. That's kind of shifted to now where perhaps meal has taken the back seat, and the oil is really what these crushers are after, just due to we saw a really impressive rise in oil prices through early fall. Like I said, it really fell off in November, but the demand for soybean oil very strong, as we'll get into here. Jumping into the biofuel market, just keeps expanding, specifically with the renewable diesel market. The biodiesel market's been fairly steady. The U.S. has shown a massive preference towards drop-in fuels in the form of renewable diesel, but as you can see, this is very friendly to the soybean market, just another avenue of demand to help perhaps soften the blow for years where the U.S. is struggling to compete in the world soybean export market. Driving this as well as, soybean oil exports have just skyrocketed this year. I think, going into yesterday's report, total soybean oil exports for 2024-25 were running like upwards of 60% above the USDA's entire year estimate, just 2 months into the marketing year thus far. So very impressive soybean oil demand, especially with, driven by palm oil. There's some production concerns in Indonesia and Malaysia, where the majority of that is produced. So has allowed soybean oil to be very attractive in the world stage as a feedstock for biofuel production. Wrapping it up on soybeans, just another price potential here. As you can see, soybeans futures have retraced about 80% of their 2020 to 2022 price rally. Rallies from here I see as potentially difficult, just given the current supply situation. Obviously, Mother Earth gets the last word always on the South American production, but we will see on that. If we have a hiccup there, like I said, we could see some business swing back to the U.S. on exports and bolster these prices. Just what I'm kind of looking out, I think $11 per bushel, probably your medium term ceiling. More realistically, I expect futures in the low 10s. But that being said, I do tend to think we may be nearer to the bottom than, some bearish traders may disagree with me on that. But I tend to think, just given the same situation as corn, where we are just inflationary over the last 5 years, I don't see bean prices slipping down into the 8s or anything. I think there's enough domestic demand to keep things propped up here, but definitely don't expect any returns right now back to, a $13, $14 level unless we get a significant supply issue coming out of South America here after the first of the year. Wheat, I don't have a lot of comments on wheat right now. It's kind of in a way different spot compared to soybeans and corn in terms of their marketing year. What I will say, and John touched on this, but winter wheat conditions vastly improved going to the dormancy period in the U.S. The opening rating in early October was, as far as I could tell, going back to 1986, which I believe is when that crop rating series started, we were the lowest on record at only 38% of the crop rated good to excellent. That's completely shifted. It's now, about 55 or so percent of the crop good to excellent, and the poor to very poor ratings dropped from about 23% in early October down to around 11-12%. So this stemming from much needed rain, and especially in the southern plain areas through the fall, really helped to alleviate a lot of drought concerns there and put the winter wheat crop in pretty good shape going into its dormancy period. Looking at the world wheat situation, it's pretty impressive how just efficient the world wheat market is. Typically the world produces in wheat what it needs. As you can see, though, consumption continues to steadily increase, and production kind of has years where it levels off, then kind of legs higher, then dips. And it's in the years where you see any kind of dip where you can see world trade routes shift around to get wheat to where it's needed, and that's where you get the exciting bullish wheat markets. But overall, a very self-sufficient market when it comes to world wheat production. Looking at the U.S. and how it fits into the world wheat market, U.S. wheat exports are trying to rebound from what was just an abysmal year last year, as wheat exports last year were like a 50-plus year low going back to the early 70s. But that being said, we are seeing a nice rebound here. Solid harvest, obviously, in last summer, so there was an abundant supply, and the U.S. really stepped in there to get ahead of schedule here on the wheat. We're about halfway through the marketing year, and we're about 17% above last year. The USDA, 19% above, with the USDA running 17% above. So right on pace there, and a nice bump there. But we'll look at, it'll be interesting to see moving forward how the U.S. manages to fit in. Unfortunately, the U.S. just struggles from some geographic boundaries to really, you're talking about Egypt and Indonesia, countries that, really rely on wheat imports, and the U.S., unfortunately, compared to Russia and Australia in particular, just struggle to compete geographically in terms of ocean freight and offers to get their wheat there at an affordable level for those countries. Jumping into Russia, obviously you can't talk about wheat without talking about Russia. They've been the big dog the last several years with their export program just skyrocketing. It is worth noting Russia vastly decreased their February forward export quota down to about 11 million metric tons. So it'll be interesting to see how much of the 45 or so million metric ton program they were able to export in the free. They basically, exporters there get from June through January to export freely before the government steps in to protect domestic supplies. So looking at that, you can tell as Russia's production goes, their exports go. When they produce more, they export more. It's a pretty impressive correlation between the two, the blue and orange lines on that chart. So they're still kind of messing with their production numbers. They keep sliding. So with that, their stocks are also historically low due to just how strong they've exported wheat in the last year or two. So it'll be very interesting to see when they leave the market in February, what country steps in to fill that gap. Right now, unfortunately, it's looking to be more of a Europe and Australia play, but you never know. The U.S. might be able to, especially with the drop in U.S. futures, might be able to step in there with some cheap offers and get some business to bolster our export program as well. Just wanted to leave you with some final marketing thoughts. This graph in particular, I think, is something people should really keep an eye on, and that this is a look at the carries that have really had an impressive collapse in carry, from especially pre-harvest, as U.S. production has shrunk slightly and demand has obviously been very strong. As you can see, going into December here, the March-May futures spread for corn only paying about just over a nickel of carry right now, and the Jan to May soybean spread paying just about 16.5 cents to store soybeans out past April, May. So I look at this as the market's sending a message that it's not willing right now to pay for grain to be held, and factoring in interest on corn and soybeans with the current prices available, it gets harder to justify storing grain past this just because of the interest on the money that you could get now selling now. Obviously, I'm not saying don't store any grain. There's still seasonality and prices to consider, and prices tend to pick up in May and June, especially depending on where you are at in the U.S. Especially Western Corn Belt, you can really see a deficit area for summer corn. So that being said, basis right now is looking like it'll have to do the heavy lifting for those deficit areas. You're going to have to see a pretty good corn basis to pay and incentivize people to want to carry corn much past May, where these spreads are sitting right now. My final thoughts, just on marketing here, be realistic about price expectations in the face of these growing surpluses we've seen in the last 1 to 2 years. Have offers in front of the market, but always be revising those. You can throw a $5 offer in front of the market right now, but be realistic about what to expect here moving forward for grain prices, especially with South America harvest largely unknown right now. Take advantage of the strong basis we're seeing in the market and these shrinking spreads. Like I said, use caution moving forward. If you decide to store grain, work with your merchandiser or grain buyer on basis carry. Try to pick their brain on what they expect late summer basis would be. Make sure you're getting paid one way or the other to hold your grain out into the summer. In terms of specific strategies I like, in terms of getting out in front of the uncertainty here for demand into 2025. You can always sell the grain today, protect your the upside with an inexpensive call option through May that allows you to stay in the market through the April, May, June period where we typically see futures prices tend to perk up. Another strategy I like is looking at like a min-max type option, a 435, 475 put call min-max yesterday, for example, was about $0.10 in cost. I think given where we're at today, locking in a floor at 425 after fee, there's no basis taken out of that, so consider in your local basis. But to me, that captures, as going back to the corn charts we looked at, captures most of what I see as the upside potential, and it keeps you in the market up to 465 after a fee, which I think would prove to be a good place to be here going into 2025. And then other than that, inquire about seasonal averaging products. You can always lock basis in with your favorite grain buyer And then, all these grain companies, it seems these days, have some sort of bundled product that allows you to average futures prices over a period. I like looking at the May, June, July period. Like I said, I like that for old crop and new crop. You tend to hit your highs in those months. So it takes a lot of risk off the table, with also taking some stress off of your mind, not having to, tune into the market every day and stress over every penny up or penny down. So I'm a really big fan of those averaging tools. So I would definitely suggest inquiring about those. Otherwise, that's about all I have. I appreciate everyone for tuning in, and thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Rhett. That's really interesting.
Thank you.
I am looking forward to getting into some of the questions that have come into the Q&A for us. I've got them in that Q&A section. Please, if you have any more, drop them in there. We're going to take a quick break here to bring John Baranick back into the studio to answer some of those questions, and I hope you keep with us. I know we're running a little bit longer than we were planning. We are going to get into our cattle market outlook after we finish with our weather and grain markets Q&A. So please stick with us. Drop any questions you have in the chat, and we'll be right back with more of our conversation about weather and markets. Welcome back to the DTN Ag Summit. I'm Farm Business Editor Katie Dellinger. I've got a couple of our friends here at the desk with me today. I've got DTN lead analyst Rhett Montgomery, who just finished his grain market outlook, and DTN ag meteorologist John Baranick, who gave us his weather forecast earlier this morning. What an interesting conversation, guys.
Sure. I mean, I don't know. It was interesting for me and hearing from Rhett for the first time here at the summit, kind of how he thinks and how he's looking at the markets a bit, and how weather kind of plays into that quite a bit, and especially on the production side. We'll see how all that kind of goes. But it's weird because we're both kind of in the forecasting business, and it tends to be kind of difficult for the both of us.
Which our first question, which I read to you when we were off camera because it was funny from our friend Kent, was seeing as though it's so hard to predict and all predictions have been wrong. How confident are you in this prediction?
Yeah, well, I hope I got the point across is that I'm not confident in the weather forecast, at least here, especially here across the U.S. going into the 2025 season. There's that big driver's not there, so all these little smaller ones that are harder to predict out in the future are going to be playing more of a role. And models can kind of get hints at what that might mean a month away. Within the 2-week period, they grab onto at least something's going to happen. But it's really within that 1 week where you really understand, okay, how cold might this actually be, or are we actually going to get a big storm out of it? So, it's fun and disruptive to my life watching these sorts of things happen, because it's difficult to see real far in advance how that might all play out.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure, Rhett, that's something you see in the grain markets all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just at this point, and I would recommend to anyone who's interested to go scroll to like page 38 on the WASDE reports, where they have those 90% confidence ratings. It's really interesting to look at just especially on the world side, there's some huge. I was talking with my predecessor, Todd Holtman, yesterday about one that I've noticed on soybean ending stocks for the U.S. has like a 70% variance historically through the 42 years they've been doing the WASDE report. So just not a whole lot of stock to be put in these numbers here, but maybe the more important thing is, what the market has is what the market will trade. You can try to outguess the government all you want, and you could have the number in your back pocket today of what that ends up being, but it might not do you much good, because what perception is half of the market, and what the market thinks is going to be matters more often than what actually will end up happening. So
that's a very good point, that the market is half prediction and trading what they think it will occur.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I've got a couple of questions for you, John, kind of spinning off that. So in the past years, we've watched for words like La Nina when we're talking about weather. This year, how much attention should we pay when we hear phrases like subtropical jet stream or polar vortex? Or are there other keywords and phrases to watch in the weather forecast?
That's an excellent question. And it's really going to be dependent on what's important at that time. I talked about a couple of them, right? I talked about the MJO, I talked about the polar vortex, but there are hundreds of things that affect our weather and could easily play a different role at different times, either during the winter, spring, or summer. So, the big ones for me are the ones that I talked about, but you might not hear about MJO so often because it's so far away. If you're watching your local weather forecast, they won't talk about it. And it's, as I kind of tried to show here, it's a little complicated. So they probably won't talk about that much. But the polar vortex definitely has a huge impact for us, especially all the way through about April. So whenever you hear that word, I would perk them and say, okay, what's going on? It might be a little clickbaity and with it, but that's going to be the big one here for the next few months. Subtropical jet stream is one that is going to be very important for those folks across the South. If you hear that and they're talking about a weather system to go along with it, then that could be important for those areas that we're expecting to be a little bit drier across the South. Otherwise, everything's going to get thrown at you. Whatever meteorologists are going to point to as the cause for what the weather's going to do here over the next week, 2 weeks, month. Polar vortex is going to be the big one. And you might hear something about the Alaskan ridge, where we talk about upper level ridges all the time, but it pokes up into Alaska, and when it does, colder air follows down east of the Rockies. So that might be another thing to look at. But if you've listened to weather forecasts over the years, and I'm sure you have, they'll pick on whatever they feel is kind of germane to the conversation at the moment, and it could be just about anything.
So I've got a couple of weather questions here for you. We'll start with one for our Canadian friends. They want to know a little bit about your forecast for the Canadian prairies.
Yeah, so I tried, maybe not great, but I tried to kind of tie that in to where the Northern Plains is right now. And it's kind of in a similar situation where it's been drier. We have significant areas of drought up there. And, the weather over the winter, we try to build as much snowpack as possible so that we've got some soil moisture there for spring. Our pattern does favor some at least normal-ish looking potential there for storm systems to move across the northern tier of the U.S. That also includes the Canadian prairies. So I'm hopeful that will come to fruition and we can kind of build in some of that soil moisture. But I also talked about how some of that colder air may linger deeper into spring, and that might push off planting intentions. So we're a little concerned about that. The Canadian prairies were a very dramatic area in terms of weather, just swings of cold and wet to hot and dry and then back to wet throughout the season. We didn't stick in a very good spot for crop development there this year. And I'm a little concerned that we might kind of repeat that for next year. Again, confidence low, but we might have an issue where we're a little cold and wet to start that might impact planting, and then the summer will do what the summer will do, I guess. And I mentioned I wasn't confident in that, but if we go on history a little bit, we'll lean on that a little bit more. Hotter and drier during the summer might be a concern up there too.
Okay, I've got a question here. I know you guys love to be compared to other forecasters. Or to weigh in on other people's analysis or insights. So this is a question you're going to love, Sean. Elwyn Taylor has been calling for the 89-year cycle for drought to peak in 2025. Last peak was 1936. What are your thoughts?
It's a very interesting theory, and it's one that can't be tested because we don't have the data for it yet. So, you can go back and talk about tree rings and ice cores and stuff like that and get an idea, but you don't really have real data across the Corn Belt until you get to 1900. So we've got 125 years, and if the cycle is 89 years, you're only able to fit one cycle in there. So we don't have really good data, honestly. I'll be interested. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong. It could end up being right. And, the picture I showed for the summer forecast doesn't look great. Again, low confidence, but it doesn't look great. But, I'll be interested to see if that works out. Because like I said, we just don't have the real data for that yet. Mm-hmm. You'd like to see if it's a true cycle, and it goes on an 89-year cycle. You need a couple of instances of those ups and downs for that cycle. Sorry, I got in your face there, Rhett. Of that actually playing out to be confident that that makes a lot of sense. So interesting, sure, but I'll wait and see.
Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the data in this space is evolving so rapidly. It's something we've talked about historically in this program, is the evolution of data in the weather space. I do have a natural follow-up to that, but I do want to ask some weather. So I'll ask you this one real quick, or I want to ask some markets questions. All right. Are you incorporating AI in your weather models or forecasts? If yes, how are you using it? Is it enhancing the short-term accuracy or long-term forecasts?
AI is completely new, and it's a wild frontier for weather. The most interesting part of it, I think, is it works off of patterns. So when we give our forecasts for DTN, especially the long range ones, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at historical patterns, and so we're trying to find those that kind of match up to that and what that might mean for the future. So AI is definitely going to play a role in that. For short-term forecasts, I'm not so sure it'll have a whole lot of interest. But the great thing about AI is that it is very low intensity on computer resources needed for it. It looks at a pattern, it finds a pattern, and gives out a forecast. Weather models right now are what we call deterministic, which we feed it some equations, we feed it some data. It runs through all these equations over months at a time and spits something out for you. AI can do this instead of what would take 6 to 10 hours, AI can do this in 20, 30 minutes. So that's, I think, is really interesting. We do use it somewhat here at DTN, not necessarily for the forecasting portion yet. We use it in some other areas related to weather and not related to agriculture in some of our other business units. Mm-hmm. But it is something that they are specifically looking at incorporating into our forecast engine for the long range specifically, but in the short range, it could help clean up some of those things as well. So yes, it is happening, but we're kind of really right on the doorstep of that starting to be a major thing here.
Thank you, John. I think that plays really well into this next question we have for you, Rhett, which is a bit about, with the weather being more uncertain this year, without a really strong La Nina or El Nino driver, should we be, how diligent do farmers need to be about weather rallies or plummets in the mid-season of 2025?
Well, I think should always be on the lookout. It's the market's job, as we talked about, to build, premium or discounts into what they think is happening. So, if you look, mid-season 2025, we're talking of May, June, looking back at, 40 plus years of, talking about new crop of 2025, looking at the December board that you're going to price that off of, 38-ish years, you see your peak come in those months. I don't know the exact statistic, but it's an impressive seasonality towards high prices in that period. And that's by no accident, and then most of that is, weather premium being built into the markets. And I'd even point to right now, the soybean market in the U.S., we've been hanging out, 15 to 20 cents above contract lows with all this supply, and a lot of traders, bearish traders, have said, well, why isn't it taking out the contract lows at this point? And my argument would be, the market's job is to maintain risk premium where it sees fit. And right now we have a lot of weather left to trade on South America, so it's going to maintain at least some risk premium, albeit a dime or so. It's not a lot, but some risk premium ahead of a lot of growing season. I think we'll see the same thing, I think, in 2025, regardless of if the weather looks great in April and May, and all the models say it's going to be a wet June and a perfect July for pollination for corn, and The market will still, I think, maintain some risk premium because, as said, these models can change, and until we see it happening and we see the filling stage and we see these models with exact certainty. I think you will see the potential for weather rallies that time of year, even in the most bearish of seasons. You'll see maybe a limited rally and a super if we come out with a huge corn and soybean planted acres number, for example, you're probably talking about some limited upside, but I do believe the market nonetheless will give an opportunity for some sort of risk premium ahead of the bulk of the U.S. growing season.
And we did kind of see that this past year too, right? I mean,
Yeah,
we had overall pretty good weather. I mean, there were some things here and there, and it got dry late that kind of cut things off. But I mean, we still saw, even within that season, ups and downs that kind of mirrored what was going on with the weather, right?
Yeah, exactly. We were still trading, over $12 for beans and over $5 for new crop corn by like late May. So, I mean, and by that point, you had a lot of private analysts with over 2 billion bushel carryouts on corn and over, 500 million bushel carryouts on beans. So it just goes to show that the market's always going to build some risk into that to basically reward participants for weathering the storm and basically growing our food for us is how I kind of see it. So.
Well, given some of the potential, we start out every year looking at the upcoming season. USDA uses a trend yield number to go with. Let's assume we're going to have another trend yield year. What market do you think has more potential for upside, corn or soybeans?
That's a good question. I think a lot of it will be determined by the February averages, or something I'm really going to be watching with keen interest to see what that ratio comes at for insurance guarantees, soybeans versus corn. It has been corn has been very resilient compared to soybeans through this fall. Today, as an example, when I last looked for coming into the studio, corn was up and beans were down, and there's been a lot of instances of days like that where corn's demand picture has been a little more friendly, and obviously their world competition is a little more delayed currently in the safrinha crop in Brazil. So I would like to see those before saying with a lot of certainty, but right now I think you're maybe seeing a shift back towards some corn acre potential. That being said, I like the corn situation for demand. I think it's very strong, and I like it for beans too, especially when we start talking about biofuels and the potential there. But it feels like soybeans have become such a focal point in world production. Everyone is, South America and Argentina are racing to plant more and more beans because, Brazil has their own biofuel industry to supply too. So I think you're going to potentially continue to see a lot more focus maybe on beans in the world market, but in terms of the U.S. market, maybe a shift back for corn. So that's a pretty loaded answer, and I apologize. It's pretty early to tell until we get more of that, insurance data and what's going to protect farmers a little more, and before they go into their seasons or their decisions into planting season anyway. But right now, I honestly think it's a toss-up, and both commodities have positive points and negative points, but especially when looking at either the supply or demand side.
Interesting. Another interesting question for you. Did your price projections factor in possible negative factors from the Trump administration if it imposes more tariffs on some of our trading partners? Or I guess how much did the political environment factor into your thoughts on prices?
So I would say very minimally on those charts. Those charts were pretty technically driven, just looking at swing points, which, given where we are right now with just the, fundamental information right now is just pretty slim and hard to come by. Not a lot has changed in the last 30 days in terms of, world markets, in terms of supply and demand. So I believe, the technical and chart side tends to drive trade a little more this time of year anyway. So I was really more looking at that, but I did kind of in the back of my mind, when suggesting those, strategies, for example, obviously it's more impactful to the soybeans right out of the gate because we know that China has a strong preference for Brazilian beans. The Trump potential tariffs aren't necessarily going to change that preference. But that being said, it can get a lot worse because even with our exports being way down, China's still about 50% of our business. So we're still very reliant on them for world exports. So that is something to keep in mind. But the market kind of knows that. What was a little more surprising, a couple weeks ago when, or I guess it was 1 week ago when Trump made those comments about Mexico and Canada, was the inclusion in Mexico and his bone to pick along with the border down there and their side of managing that. So that was really the bearish twist out of that. But like I said during the talk on markets, it's really hard to tie any economics to it at this point until Mexico comes and says this is the tariff on corn. Then we can start really penciling in, okay, Brazilian corn freights to Mexico across the ocean at this, and Mexico or U.S. corn rails down at X, and Brazilian is Y. What decisions do they make moving there? Because that would be the fear, is that they go and make a friend out of Brazil and get their corn out of Brazil or Argentina. And in the last 5 years of history have showed that when you lose that business to Brazil, it's been hard to get back.
And with Mexico being our largest, are they still our largest corn market?
Yeah,
corn buyer?
about 40, just over 40% of current commitments are slated to go there this year.
That's a big market. You don't want to lose any share of that.
Yeah.
If you're top buyer.
No, absolutely. And we'll see how it plays out. I think there's incentives on both sides, kind of like we saw in 2018. People forget that, for during President Trump's first term, he had a bone to pick with Canada and Mexico, and he wanted NAFTA completely reworked, and they did so with pretty much the same agreement with a few minute adjustments, but it was pretty impressive, all things considered, how quickly they reached that agreement. It was by like June of 2018 they had that pretty much done, and there was really no hiccups in between his inauguration and that being done. So I think there's incentive on both sides of the aisle to get some sort of agreement. And I think we've seen that with world leaders, meeting and talking on the phone several times since those comments to try to get this figured out before it's felt by, the people on the grassroots level of it all. So.
Well, I think we are running over on our time, so I'm going to end our question and answer here. But if you have any other questions for John or Rhett, please feel free to continue to dropping those in the Q&A, or you can send them emails to either me or directly to them, and we'll make sure we get answers to you. We're going to take a really quick break here before I bring on DTN Livestock editor ShaLe Stewart. She's joining us remotely from her ranch out in Wyoming, and we're really looking forward to hearing more from her about what's going on in the cattle market and in the cattle industry as we get ready to turn the page into 2025. Hang on with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the DTN Ag Summit. I'm Farm Business Editor Katie Dellinger. I'm here today to talk a little bit more with you about the cattle markets, or at least I'm going to introduce our expert who will share all of that information for you. It's my pleasure to introduce ShaLe Stewart. She's our DTN Livestock Analyst. She is located out in Cody, Wyoming on her family's farm and ranch. She's joining us from her local library where they have great internet connection. ShaLe, wonderful to have you back with us.
Oh my goodness, Katie, it's been a great morning getting to listen to both John and Rhett this morning, and I am so excited to be joining you to kind of give an outlook about what we expect the cattle market to do in 2025, what it did in 2024, and I must say, I think that there was some strategic planning behind the scenes that I didn't know about when you allowed the cattle market segment to be the very last of the day, because it has been a market that has simply been unmatched this year. So without further ado, Katie, if you can hear me, if you can see my screens, I'm going to jump into the presentation. So
go for it, ShaLe. We're excited.
Awesome. Well, without further ado, let's dive into the cattle market and beef industry for what we saw in 2024 and what we may expect for the year ahead. And lo and behold, my friends, even though you heard from the expert himself, John Baranick, about what we, saw this past year in regards to weather and what we could potentially expect next year moving forward, I think that there are key things that we need to hone into and we need to understand as cattlemen about where we sit in regards to our weather patterns, because really so much of our business is derived from these realities. And so I think let's go ahead and start at the very beginning. Let's look at it from a 10,000-foot view, work our way to the fine details of the nitty-gritty by the end of the point. But I think let's go ahead and note that 42% of the cattle inventory is within an area experiencing drought. And so, ladies and gentlemen, as we start this presentation and we first talk about the beef cow herd, where we sit in regards to growth and expansion, or are we still going to be in a liquidation phase of the cycle, this is where we have to start the questions, because there are two main reasons, or there are two key factors that tell us whether or not the U.S. beef cow herd will be in either a growth mode or in a continued recession. And really, that's drought and that's profitability. And so when we look at this chart, we know that we need to see better moisture accumulation through the winter, through the spring, if we're going to continue, if we're going to start to see the early stages of the beef cow herd beginning to be rebuilt. Now, obviously, like John shared earlier, it's really a mixed outlook. We really can't put the cart before the horse in this situation and say, hey, you know what, we just see from our models that we're going to get the moisture that we hope for, that we're going to see early green grass and just great moisture accumulation throughout the winter and into the spring. We don't know that yet. But like I said before, this will be something that you need to continue to monitor through the remainder of 2024 into 2025, as it'll play a key role in whether or not the beef cow herd begins to be rebuilt back in 2025 or not. So then shifting gears, let's go ahead and talk about where we're at with the U.S. beef cow herd. As you know, every single January, the USDA shares their cattle inventory report at the end of the month. And that gives us an idea of how many beef cows are in the United States. And so I really like this chart because it does a great job visually showing where we're at in regard to our numbers. And so go ahead and take your eyes to the right-hand side of this chart. And I have highlighted here in yellow because it's an estimate. It is not obviously data that we have yet. But we're anticipating that the January 2025 beef cow inventory is going to be around 28 million head. Yes, that is, again, a decrease from the data in which we saw a year ago when the cow herd came out at 28.2 million head. And so you might ask me, you might say, well, ShaLe, these feeder cattle prices, they've been phenomenal. We've seen more profitability, or maybe hopefully profitability, because we know that higher prices don't guarantee profitability. So what I should say there is we've seen better returns from our feeder cattle sales, but that doesn't mean that we're seeing growth in the cow herd yet. And really, I think that comes down to a couple of factors. Obviously, going back a couple of years when drought was such a limiting factor to this industry, there were so many cows liquidated and sold. And a lot of the individuals that sold out in that time, they are not going to be jumping back into this marketplace. Then you go ahead and add the pressures of returning to the market for other producers who are willing to absorb some of that risk and some of that market reality. And it's a tough market space to jump into. Inputs are high, overheads are expensive, and honestly, there is so much risk in this market that people have been hesitant. So what I'm here to tell you is that if you shift your eyes to the middle of this chart and you see the last time in our cycle in 2014 when we saw the lull met for that cycle time, we saw a pretty quick build back in 15, 16, 17, and 18. I don't believe that we're going to see that this time around in this cycle. I believe that the U.S. cow herd is going to take much longer to be built back, and that honestly is kind of an exciting reality on the short term, because that means that the leverage of the market is going to remain in the hands of cow-calf producers. Now, adversely, something that we need to realize and be prepared for and cognizant about is that every time we go through this cycle and we see the tops and the bottoms, we never return back from what historical data shows us to the previous high. So do we know where the cow herd is going to be built back to next go around? We don't. I'm guessing it could be around that 30 million head, but as always, time will tell us, and that's yet to be seen. So I've told you that the U.S. beef cow herd is not in growth mode yet, but I think that this chart does a tremendous job showing you that nor are we in the mass liquidation phase and period in the cycle of what we were in the last couple of years. Thus far through 2024, there's been roughly 2.4 million head of beef cows slaughtered. And from a weekly basis on a per head standpoint, that means that in 2024, there's been roughly 55,000 head of beef cows processed on a weekly basis. You compare that number to what we saw in 2023, it's down notably. But you compare that number to what the industry saw in 2022, and we are processing roughly 20,000 head less beef cattle in 2024 than what the market was doing in 2022, when really the tide just turned and we were in mass liquidation. But I think the maybe bigger telling factor of this chart is if you look at the bottom line, the blue line, or go ahead and look at the data of 2014 and 2015, that data tells us that nor are we in our growth mode yet, like I've iterated before. In 2014, there was roughly 49,000 head of beef cows processed on a weekly basis. In 2015, there was roughly 42,000 head of beef cows processed on a weekly basis. And then boom, by 16, 17, 18, they were in growth mode. And so that number remained low. Given that we are still seeing roughly 55,000 head of beef cows processed on a weekly basis, I believe that we're still seeing a little bit of liquidation. That largely probably comes from the driving factor that drought has been a continued issue. Now, moving ahead, I think that there is a conversation that we need to have here. And that is that, liquidation doesn't necessarily have to be in growth mode or in a liquidation phase. It can just simply hold stagnant. We can be in a holding period. And that's what I kind of expect for 2025. There are some factors that are incentives for growth. The fact that feed is cheap, the fact that feeder cattle prices are really strong. But at the same time, there are hindrances of growth as well. We don't know what the drought outlook is going to be. Inputs are still extremely expensive. Overheads aren't cheapening. And when it comes to the price in which folks are able to sell cull cows for, I mean, it was just a couple of years ago that you could buy a bred first calf heifer for $1,600. In this past year, in 2024, a lot of cull cows, remind you, cull cows were going to town for $2,000. So there's been incentive for there to be continued liquidation in this marketplace. But what we expect for 2025 moving forward is that cow-calf producers will remain in control of the market's leverage because supply numbers are going to remain to be tight. So with that, let's go ahead and shift gears and begin to talk about the fed cattle market and what we have seen this past year and what's yet to come. And if this chart isn't exciting to you, I think that you just need a stronger cup of coffee, because it doesn't get much more vibrant, dynamic, prosperous than this. The only time that I'm going to let you say that something is potentially more exciting is when we get to the feeder cattle side of things. But hang with me here, because there's a lot to be learned in this chart here. I think it's important to look at time in the span, in cycles. And so in the middle of this chart here, you'll see where last time at the cycle peak, the market topped in 2014 and in 2015. But now advance your eyes to the right-hand side of this chart, and you'll see where the prices are trading today. As indicated in yellow, highlighted on the right-hand side, we saw all-time high fed cattle prices reached in June and July of 2024. And now, obviously, the market endured some midsummer pressure. That's a little bit because of supplies. We know that fed cattle supplies become more burdensome in the summer months. And then also we had the equity market meltdown in the beginning of August, which pressured the complex as well. But as we sit here at the very end of the year, we're seeing a rally again. Supplies are tight, demand is strong. And so really, as we look to turning the chapter and into 2025, the sky's the limit. I in a couple of slides here, I'll show what we might expect, but really I'm just so excited to say that supplies are manageable, demand is exuberant, and so really there is no reason why these prices shouldn't be able to maintain these upper threshold, these top tier prices in which we've seen. One thing that we need to talk about, though, as it affects fed cattle prices is our slaughter speed. Thus far through 2024, there's been roughly 27 million head of cattle processed. That is down compared to 2023. In 2024, we've only seen a weekly average slaughter pace of 599,000 head, so sub 600,000. Compare that to 2023, and we were processing right at 620,000 head of fed cattle, or of cattle, excuse me, each and every week. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why, ShaLe? Here in a minute, you're going to show us box beef prices, and we know they've been phenomenal. We know they've been strong. We know they've been a driving factor of this marketplace. So why are we processing less cattle if demand is so strong? Well, remember, folks, we're not the only people in this industry. There are other factors. There are other industry players in this business as well, and packers can manage their margin through slaughter speeds. Obviously, they buy cattle by the head and they sell them by the pound, and so they have to weigh their costs on the purchasing aspect and their selling opportunities from the beef aspect. And so, as packers are knowing that the U.S. beef cow herd sits at a historical low, they say, okay, one way that we can manage the cash cattle market from becoming too high, from really just rallying unbridledly, is by managing slaughter speeds, and they've done that through 2024. And I promise you, they're going to continue to do that through 2025 as their business, allows them the opportunity to do so. But I really believe that we're going to see especially reduced slaughter speeds in the third and fourth quarters of 2025. As we're going to simply be extremely tight on supplies moving into that time period. Here's a part of the story, here's a part of the market, here's a part of the industry maybe that I think that we really need to spend some time talking about. Because carcass weights, as the market's rock and rolling and rallying, we kind of sometimes get a little lackadaisical in the fine details. And here is one that I'm just simply not going to let you miss out on, because it is something that's going to change our industry for decades to come, and that is carcass weights. In 2024, the average steer carcass weight was 929 pounds. Roughly 24 pounds heavier than a year ago, and roughly 28 pounds heavier than the 5-year average. The red bar here is really indicating, what these weights are, and it does a good job of visually showing you just how much more product is being added to the marketplace. And I want to just simply, pause for a second from the busyness of charts and the moving of a PowerPoint and say, stop and understand what this means from an industry standpoint. And I want to share what Dr. Darrell Peel did a study on here, and he just really beautifully laid it out. When in his study, he said that carcass weights have trended heavier over the last 60 years. Take that into account for a minute. Over the last 60 years, with steer carcass weights increasing by an average of 4 pounds per year. And so, okay, if this trend has lasted over the last 60 years and averaging an additional 4 pounds per every year, what's that doing in regards to our added production? What's going to happen to you and I, cow-calf producers, when feedlot managers are in a different position, when supplies from a sheer numbers perspective are exuberant in the marketplace? When we start to get our cow herd built back, the supply burden in regards to added pounds in the marketplace is going to be problematic. It's going to be crippling, I believe, for the cow-calf producer, because they're going to have a hard time getting their calves procured when we know that the feedlot inventory turnover isn't as aggressive as it was in year past. We know that from the Kansas feedlot data, because it used to be that cattle spent 120 days on feed, but that's not the case anymore. The Kansas feedlot data shows us that steers are averaging 190 days on feed, which is up 9 days compared to just a year ago, and up 40 days compared to a decade ago. And then I want to also share another little plug here. If you are somebody who is keeping females, maybe you're keeping your replacement heifers, or you're out procuring females, and I know not a lot of folks are able to pick up leases because the competition for land, man, is it fierce and aggressive. Tell me, if their steer mates, if their steers are gaining an average of 4 pounds per year because of genetics, because of feed, because of days on feed, what do you think is happening to the females in which our industry is producing? They're getting bigger too. And while I know and understand that we need pounds of meat in this market, we have to be very careful from a rural grass level standpoint that we are not making a female that is going to cost us house and home, and that we aren't going to be able to be profitable with because she requires too much inputs. Food for thought, something kind of fun. All right, I promised you I'd talk about the box beef prices and what we've seen. And I think that is so crazy to compare the 2024 choice and select price averages to that of 2020. Because remember, 2020, when COVID hit, packing plants shut down, beef prices skyrocketed through the roof. But yet, here we are in 2024, and our prices have averaged exuberantly more than what they were in 2020. And so I think that this is one of the biggest factors of why the market has been able to rally as aggressively as it has through 2024 is because our beef demand, it has been utterly exceptional from a domestic standpoint and from an international standpoint. Demand has been exceptional, and I am so thankful because I do not believe that the market would have been able to achieve the upward potential in which it did in this rally if it weren't for the demand. All right, so I don't know if you love this slide or hate this slide because it kind of feels like you're getting a little piece of information that you're not supposed to see. But as we as businessmen and women continue to track and monitor the industry, we need to know what's going on in the packer side of things, because how they're doing in their business models tells us how they're going to act and perform in the cattle sector. Like I said, in regards to managing throughput, in regards to buying in the cash cattle market, in regards to thinking about shackle space and things of that nature. So we need to talk because it wasn't a good year for them. In 2024, packers averaged $184 per head. That was lower compared to 2023 when they averaged $250 per head. And that was sharply lower than compared to the 5-year average where they averaged just shy of $500 per head. But adversely, last time in the industry cycle, in the market cycle, when we saw the beef cow herd at a low in 2024, they only averaged $123 per head. So the reason why I want to share this data with you specifically is to again remind you that packers, they're businessmen. They're far better businessmen than you and I are. You know, sometimes cattlemen, they like to say, you know, round their margins by hundreds of dollars. Oh, I think that pallet of salt, oh, that pallet of mineral oil costs, I think $2,100, maybe 22, maybe 23, $2,500 on the top side. And these folks, they're rounding, they're taking their dollars out to the pennies, the percentile, the fractions. They're far better businessmen and women than you and I are. And so we need to know what's going on in their sphere so that we can understand how their actions are going to affect us. And I'm again here to tell you that in 2025, they are going to keep slaughter speeds at a minimum simply because they have to manage their margin. Another saving grace of the market this past year, even though our exports are down a bit, has been the demand in which we've seen. Because we have to remember that exports aren't only in regards to product being pushed and sold in regards to a metric ton standpoint or a pounds perspective, but it's also a dollar perspective as well. And even though the market exported 2.25 billion pounds of beef, which was down roughly 2.8% compared to a year ago, thankfully, from a dollar perspective, we exported 7 million head. Sorry, the numbers are getting me. Our exports were up from a dollar perspective 5% compared to a year ago. Now, unfortunately, next year, as we look at the marketplace, because of the dollar's strength, because of our limited supplies, I'm guessing that our exports aren't probably going to be as strong in 2025. But still, let's remember that 2024 is on track to be the second largest export year behind 2022. So I don't believe that our exports are going to be a problem. I don't believe it's necessarily going to be because of political factors. I believe it's truly going to be because our beef is expensive and our beef is limited because of where we sit once again in a supply standpoint with the U.S. beef cow herd. Now let's go ahead and transition a little bit and talk about the feeder cattle imports. And that's been a very interesting market to watch here as of late, because Mexican feeder cattle imports for the year are up 10%. Now, adversely from Canada, they're seeing a liquidation phase in their cow herd as well. So their imports are down 14%. But as you know, just 2 weeks ago, we got news that there was a cow in southern Mexico that was detected with New World screwworm. And so that has halted all Mexican cattle imports from Mexico into the United States. And that's likely going to continue through December 31st for this year, at which point it's likely that imports could be either monitored and not opened all the way, or honestly, we don't know yet. We don't know what the developments are of that, but we know that they're going to continue to be restricted through the end of the year. And then at the beginning of the year, there's the potential that it's opened up again. So what's our fed cattle price outlook for 2025? Honestly, it is, I just had to share this graph again with you all because it is so exciting. Look at the price points in which these cattle are trading for. Honestly, the industry sits at a point in which we never knew if prices would get to these levels or not, because the last time that the industry peaked in 2014 and 2015, we saw where the prices were, and we have far exceeded that. So thankfully, we sit in a position in which feedlots are extremely current and supplies are going to be manageable moving forward, and demand is utterly incredible. Now, I am a little bit concerned when the industry sees the leverage position switch from favoring cow-calf producers and the grassroots level to packers, which that's not going to be for another couple years because of where we sit with our cow herd. But the bearish factors of the fed cattle sphere are that cattle are spending more time on feed, we're seeing less inventory turnover, and if demand were ever to weaken, Annie bar the door, because that has been one of the most exhilarating factors in this marketplace. And so we have to have the strong demand. And thankfully, consumers have been so exceptional in regards to spending their dollars. Even at times in which inflation was high, they've continued to buy beef and have done so aggressively. So I told you that there was only one other chapter in this presentation that you could get potentially more excited than the fed cattle sector, and that's the feeder cattle market. And let's just dive in, because it has been one heck of a year, my friends. I hope that you were able to capitalize on the market and its strong prices. And really, I'm so excited for you to have a couple more years, hopefully, of prosperity, because these prices are unprecedented. I was watching some reports yesterday, and I saw some four weights trading for over $2,000 yesterday. I cannot believe the prices in which these cattle are selling and trading for. And honestly, given where we sit, and like I said, regards to our beef cow herd, we have to keep going back to that fact, because really it's the basis of where all of our decisions are made. And it's a ripple effect. It changes. And so given that we're going to be continuing to see limited supplies moving forward, I believe that we're going to continue to see these prices. Now, I want you to look at this chart specifically, though. We're going to take a little bit of time to talk and just really understand what it means. And so obviously you can see the continuation from the highs in 14 all the way to the highs in 2024. But I wanted you to look at the last 2 years and just how tightly, honestly, the market has traded. Whether it be from 240 to 260, the market has spent the vast majority of its time over the past 2 years trading in that window, with the support plane being around 240, the resistance plane being around 260. And as we move forward, I think that's a safe place to say where the market's going to trade. Obviously, there's more upside potential. And given that, risk continues to be a factor in the marketplace, yes, there is downside potential, obviously. We know that at some point, these days are going to come to an end and the market's going to trade lower. But for the near term, I really believe that we are going to see another year of prosperity and these elevated prices simply because of a supply standpoint. Now, do you want to understand exactly where we started to see these prices and how they compare to years past? The Corn Belt Classic did a phenomenal job of laying out that we really were going to see exceptional jumps in the marketplace. Steers weighing anywhere from 500 to 740 pounds on the Corn Belt Classic traded $17 to $35 per hundredweight more than compared to a year ago. But you compare this year's prices to 2 years ago, we're seeing anywhere from $66 to $101 per hundredweight more than compared to what the market traded in 2022. Now, obviously, we're going to see, some pressure in the market. And I really want you to understand that even if we're in a bull market, there are going to be lower days, there's going to be lower spells, there's going to be lower closes. But really, we're in a standpoint with where we're given in the supply factor of this marketplace. Prices should be able to maintain at these levels. Now, obviously, feed costs play a role in that. Moisture accumulation plays a role in that. And so those are two key factors that you're going to want to continue to monitor moving forward. And risk is something that we've touched about a little bit in this presentation, but I want to walk you through just how much risk there is in the marketplace anymore. There are two boxes highlighted in this chart. The first box was that when the avian influenza news broke and the market dipped lower, in a matter of a month's time, the market fell $11.85 because of market uncertainty. Then you advance over to the first part of August when the equity market meltdown happened, the 1st of August. The market fell $22.98 and didn't fully recover for 4 months. So if we've got a month over here for avian influenza and 4 months over here for the commodity market meltdown, well, man, it doesn't take much math to realize that over 5 months in this bull market, we had some uncertainty and we saw prices reduce because of that. And so I think it's really important that we have the conversation of that risk is not going to leave this marketplace. If anything, moving forward, the markets are trading faster. They're more sporadic. They're more influenced by external factors. You need to protect your assets. And I highly, highly, highly encourage you to consider some risk protection, whether that's, taking out an LRP, whether that's, some drought insurance, what have you. I really think that we need to be stewards in how we handle this opportunity in the marketplace, how we handle our dollars in this cattle complex, because how we handle our money today will be indicative of how we endure the next part of the cycle when prices get lower. And so with that, I can show you charts until you're blue in the face. But really, we have to take a minute to consider what this means from the story perspective, what the market, what the industry is telling, and how things are shaking out. And so I want to put the charts aside, and I want to just talk to you as a person, as a cow-calf producer myself, and as somebody who has 2 little boys at home who want to be cowboys. And I know that if I don't do a good job taking care of our business today, they will not be able to have the memories and have the understanding growing up on an operation. And I truly believe that the foundation that we lay for our operation today will either be the springboard or sinking sand when our legacy when the market turns at this peak. And so what I'm basically getting at here in this slide is that I really want you to think about the extra money that you're receiving right now in the market because prices are high. And I want you to ask yourself how you need to position your operation, your family, your business, your legacy to be able to withstand the pressures that are going to come when leverage shifts, because I promise you it will. At some point in time, the U.S. cow herd is going to be built back. We're going to see leverage shift into the hands of packers, again, as it always does in our marketplace, and you are going to see sharply lower feeder cattle prices. And so a couple years ago, I did an article for DTN, and I interviewed some folks who lived through the horrific times of the 1980s. And Jim Taylor, he was the Yellowstone Bank president in southern Montana at the time, and he's told me, ShaLe, there are 3 main reasons in which people went out of business in the 1980s. Number 1, they couldn't adjust their operating costs. Number 2, they couldn't live within their means. And number 3, they couldn't service the debt they acquired. Now, interestingly enough, I also interviewed a market mentor of mine, Ken Betchart, who was managing a 50,000 head feedlot in Texas at the time. And, many of you know him. He's a cattle sales individual for Consolidated Beef Producers. And he said similarly the same thing. He said, you've got to manage your operating costs. And then he said, also, you've got to be creative when it comes to financing. And so I share this with you because, honestly, Trey Wassenberger said it best in his TD Angus video. He said, this industry, it's got a paddle big enough for anybody's ass. And I don't want it to get you. I don't want it to get your family. I don't want it to get your operation. And so I pray that you are making sound business decisions today in the market's upcycle so that we can weather the storm together when it tips next time. I don't think that's going to be in 2025. I don't even think it's going to be in 2026 potentially, but I know it's coming at some point. So we need to make sound decisions so that we can be having these summit conversations for a long, long time. And so with that, I'm going to hand the mic back over to Katie, allow her the opportunity to maybe get some questions from all of you and just tell you thank you. It's been a wild ride in 2024, and I look forward to being with you again in 2025.
Well, thank you so much, ShaLe. Your insight's always so it's always so fresh and fun to hear about. And something you said reminded me of something Rhett had said earlier this morning. He said, 50% of the market really is perception and what gets priced in there. What do you think about that, and how does that apply to the cattle sphere?
It's spot on. Rhett did a good job of really painting that picture. And really, Ty Thompson, out of Riverton, Wyoming, works with Billings Livestock Auction. He's an auctioneer. He's an industry name. He said it too. And in the simplest form, I know that there are so many complexities behind the scenes, inputs, outputs, technical, fundamental. But he said, ShaLe, at the market's absolute simplest understanding, the market is nothing more than a psychological springboard. And sometimes the market's going to trade higher. Sometimes the market's going to trade lower, but really it's very much so psychologically driven.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. The psychology of markets, the psychology of people, why they make the choices they do. There's a lot of impact that can have on markets and where prices trade and how things move.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's something that will always be a part of our marketplace, regardless of how much we like to hone in onto the technicals or the fundamentals. People are people and people are emotional.
I've got a question here from the audience. They're asking, based on previous cattle inventory cycle lows, why do you think any build back in inventory will take longer than it has been the case historically?
Ooh, phenomenal question. And I'm really glad that somebody asked this because the market's not like what it was in 2014 and 2015. Interest rates are higher. The aging demographic of your typical cowman is older. And honestly, the risk in the business, it's not an easy pill to swallow. And so I think that some of the individuals who ran aggressively to the marketplace in 15, 16, 17 and jumped into those females, and then the market turned lower, not in very long time, that was a hard pill to swallow and it cost them a lot of money. And so I think that for a number of reasons, it's expensive to get into this business. It's a risky business to get into, and your profits, they're not guaranteed. And so that's why I believe that it's going to take longer for this US cow herd to be rebuilt because there's so much risk. And even though the market's prices are so lucrative right now and they're appealing and we like them, and you know what, anybody who sold feeder calves this year probably did a happy dance running back from the trailer. You know, it's still something that we have to be sober about and understand that risk is very much so a part of this market sphere.
And I think one thing you and I have talked a lot about too, ShaLe, is that the younger producers that are out there who are either trying to start their business or are really sort of in a beginning business stage of life, that risk aversion, that risk that's out there can be really huge. That interest cost takes a really big bite out of things.
It does take a big bite out of things. And honestly, when you're operating and just trying to make, ends meet to some degree, servicing debt, whether that's just from an operational standpoint or, maybe you've got some familial debt as well, that's really hard to stomach. And are you willing to take that risk into account? So I believe that's why we're going to see a slower build back this time around.
And now a question kind of around packers and maybe any risks that are there. Are there any labor, merger, maintenance issues, or any periods of 2025 that might influence slaughter prices at particular times?
Oh, that's a good question and one that honestly you're not able to put your finger on. And so, I know that question might be coming a little bit politically just with, some of the deportations that we've heard about and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, packers do sit in a position where they want to sell beef. They want to sell the product that they're buying because, if we move the slide deck back to the box beef prices, they are making great money on the beef that they are selling and on the cattle that they're buying and the beef that they're selling. And so, even though they're going to ratchet back slaughter speeds because they have to protect their margin, they're going to continue to participate in this sphere because that's their business. And so, unfortunately, I can't tell you, on March 25th, we're going to see packers ratchet slaughter speeds below, 550,000 head for the week. I don't. If I did, my family's business would probably be called Big Country Genetics Land in Cattle. We'd be very wealthy people, but we're not. So unfortunately, I don't have that answer for you, but I promise to share it with you when the market sees something like that.
Yeah. And then another question here is really asking for some of your perspective on the screwworm situation and whether this is likely to continue to play out and be a longer term issue next year or if it's really a short term issue.
Well, given that they've only detected it in one cow, Katie, in southern Mexico, I don't believe that this is going to be something that the market's going to dance with much longer than what we really have this month. Now, if we do, however, I know that it's unfortunate that it's limiting Mexico's imports, but at the same time, from a domestic standpoint, that's a great realization for producers in the United States because that has driven feeder cattle demand, that has driven feeder cattle prices substantially higher over the last 3 weeks. We already have limited feeder cattle supplies, and holy smokes, when you take out the import component of feeder cattle coming out of Mexico, that is exuberant. Now, one thing that I do want to note though is once they go ahead and lift that restriction, lift that ban, we will see those cattle come into the United States. And so the evolution or, the timing difference of placements of those lightweight calves, because most of the feeder cattle imports from Mexico are weighing less than 500 pounds, most weighing less than 400 pounds. We're going to see them come into the marketplace. It's just going to be at a different time.
And probably all at once rather than spread out over the time.
Yes, to some degree. Obviously, there's going to be some management, things
Mhm.
that they have to take into account. Obviously, they have to get those cattle placed. They have to have pens for them and ready. So I believe it'll be spaced to some degree. But yes, there's going to be a surge, and maybe we'll see that on a cattle on feed report. We'll see.
Okay, something to be watching for in the year ahead. Those are all the questions we have in our queue right now. ShaLe, is there anything you wanted to address or that you're thinking about, or a final takeaway for our viewers today?
I got to listen to most of the presentations here shown over the last 2 days, and I'm just so excited for the market as we move into 2025. There's so much opportunity. Yes, there's risk. Yes, to some degree, it is unbridled in the marketplace because you can't tap it back, but there are ways in which you can protect yourself. And so from a sheerly cow-calf perspective, from a cattleman's take, I pray that you run aggressively into 2025, that you are ready to capitalize on this market, given the prices that it has dancing before your eyes. But go ahead and protect yourself, because we don't want you to miss out on that opportunity because of a bobble in the market, whether that's because of something like avian influenza or a commodity market meltdown, or an equity market meltdown, I should say. But nevertheless, be aggressive and have fun in 2025, because it's going to be another good year ahead of us.
Thank you very much, ShaLe.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks. All right, and we are going to take a really quick break here while we bring on DTN Editor-in-Chief Greg Horstmeier for a little bit of analysis and wrap up of what we've talked about, not just today, but also yesterday as part of this DTN Ag Summit. Hang on just a minute. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the DTN Ag Summit. I'm Farm Business Editor Katie Dellinger. Joining me here is DTN Editor-in-Chief Greg Horstmeier. Greg, what did you think about the DTN Ag Summit that you saw today?
Thank you, Katie. Great to be here, and thanks for the wonderful job that you've done pulling this all together. Another great couple of mornings of really insightful information as we go into winter, as we start to sort of think about all the things that we did this year and start making plans for next year. I hope that this really sort of sets the tone for, ShaLe said it there at the end, what could be a fun year. I mean, it could be stressful fun. We could see some exciting times, maybe more than we want to see, but I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity to make some choices and have a real impact on our operations, whether you're in the cattle business or in the grain business.
I think that's something in my reporting and research I've seen a lot of lately, is just sort of the diverging income potential for 2024 for crop producers and livestock, for farmers, ranchers, different things. So it's one of those things we see in our audience. I really hope that there are some opportunities on the grain marketing side. And it sounds like Rhett's got some optimism or reasons for belief that the markets could go higher there too.
Right. I mean, I think John and Rhett kind of hit it in terms of watching for those opportunities and honing your skills around the marketing opportunities that you have, the contracts that the local elevators and co-ops are offering, getting interested and getting active and making some contract trade on the board, sort of pushing yourself in your marketing skills. This is a year when those kinds of things are going to make a difference, I believe, rather than just sitting back and kind of, taking what the cash market brings you. And to ShaLe's point about being aggressive, but carefully aggressive, this is the time in that market to make some extra dollars. If you can do that smartly and build that war chest for days to come. So a lot of opportunity, I think, to make some smart decisions. Also some opportunities that if we miss, we're going to have to play catch up.
And it sounds like with the weather being really hard to predict this year without one strong overarching driver of the story, that those weather rallies might come, they might go. People have to be astute and have to be paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, we often say at these sessions, paying attention is going to be important, and that's why we're here. I mean, to help you pay attention out there. But I think, again, I've said it probably in years past, but I would repeat it again, that this is a year where really having someone in your operation who's really watching what's happening on the global stage and the national stage. I mean, we've talked a little bit about, and yesterday, Chris and Jerry talked about, some of the political things that might happen and some of the decisions that might be made and some of the administrative people who might be brought into play that might have some effect on market prices and on market confidence. And so I think all of those things are going to come into play in this next year. That again, it's a year to pay attention and take advantage when there's advantage to be taken of.
It seems like there's just lots of potential and opportunities for change. No one quite knows what those changes will be. There's all that uncertainty. What are some of the things that you're watching? What's on your radar for 2025?
Well, I think everybody's kind of hit on a lot of them. I think a lot of us are watching as the new administration comes in. I mean, we specifically had that word in the theme of this year's summit for a reason, because I think we know a little bit about that situation because we saw what happened the first time around. I think in Trump 2.0, as everybody's calling it, I think we'll be interested to see how much of some of the things that are being talked about now actually come to fruition and actually come to play out. I think Rhett said it well, that there tends to be a shifting ahead of time, and some of the worries that we might have, some of the, oh my goodness, now how are we going to deal with this, that we sometimes worry about, seem to be shifting through the marketplace, and the market's kind of working on that ahead of time, and hopefully we won't have some of those oh my goodness moments. I think from a weather standpoint, I think watching how the world plays out, being ready for those potential weather spikes, if we get to see some of that, I think are the things that we're going to be trying to pay special attention to in terms of the content that we're going to be providing. I think we're going to be spending some time with this sort of uncertainty in the weather markets and in the weather in the markets on several other levels. What are some of the stories that we can do and some of the things that we can look at that help sort of build that base that ShaLe talked about? And a good example of that, honestly, is already out there, Katie, in the cover piece that you did for Progressive Farmer in December on land. I mean, one of the things we sometimes talk about at Ag Summit is land issues and what's going on in the land world, and we didn't really have time for that this time. But I think watching what happens in the land markets, they have been so stable for so long. How is that going to play out through 2025 as inflation changes, as possibly interest rate prices change, as maybe more people come into the market as land buyers outside of agriculture? The things that you covered in that January or in that December article. So I recommend everybody that gets Progressive Farmer in the mailbox to pull that December issue out. It should be at your house. And we'll also be covering that as well on DTN on our digital products. So I think that's an area that we'll continue to watch for a lot.
I think one thing we talked about a lot today, Greg, was just the cyclical nature of agriculture. I think we've got cattle on sort of a peak high, whereas crop producers are kind of dealing with some lows right now and sort of the impacts of those ups and downs. And as we talk about, these farmland values and some of the financial things, there was an interesting line in USDA's farm income data that was released earlier this week or late last week. And really one thing that Carrie Letowski, an ERS economist, said on a webinar was that, the balance sheet for agriculture doesn't always reflect the income statement. And I think with crop producers, that's one spot where you would expect that balance sheet to have shown some deterioration this year, and it didn't, because those farmland values on general keep going up. And so there's a question here about crop farmers specifically, may be needing more debt in the next coming year or 2 years as they work through some of those working capital supplies. But at the same time, their farmland values are going up enough that it's balancing out that debt to asset ratio.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think when you look at the enterprise, your total operation, we're still in pretty good condition. I mean, those of us with this gray stuff on the top of our head who lived through the 80s know that can go bad if land prices do drop, if debt accumulates beyond the land value that's there. But I do feel like we are, and as many of the economists have said, we're in a little bit of a different situation right now. I mean, we've got a crop insurance programs if the Farm Bill continues and things continue to work in that way, but we expect them to. We've got those kinds of backstops that are more adept at helping us work through these tougher times, and we know more about using working capital. We know more about finances than we did then. We're much more tied to our bankers and having those conversations that everybody says, have that relationship going. So all of that gives you at least gives me a bit of more anticipation of weathering the storm and doing it smartly. So yeah, I mean, there's no doubt having higher grain prices would be certainly helpful to family balance sheets and to what the family can do in terms of its standard of living. So that kind of becomes an issue in times like these. But I think we're in a much better shape than we've ever been.
Yep. Well, any other final thoughts or takeaways you want people to have or something to think on as we get ready to close out the Ag Summit?
Well, I think from that financial standpoint, I think thinking through those things, having those conversations, being engaged with your suppliers. Rhett was talking about being engaged with your elevator and talking about opportunities that might be there. I mean, these are just the times to do those kinds of things and to not sort of surround yourself in a cocoon, but to get out there and see what's going on. And we're gonna, my promise to our readers and our customers is we're going to do our best to help you know those things and to help understand those things as best you can, so that when you're having those conversations, you can make some decisions. Another great session, Katie. And again, we do these in December when we have a chance to think, but it's also a time when the holidays are coming up, and so want to wish everybody a safe and happy Christmas and holiday season. We've got finally some winter weather out there, so be careful feeding the livestock and doing the things that you've got to do out there. And we look forward to talking with you in 2025.
Thank you very much, Greg. And thank you very much for everyone at home who tuned in to watch and participated and asked questions today. We're so grateful for all of your feedback and your engagement. They really do make these Ag Summit and Ag Summit Series events special and unique. I also want to thank everyone on the DTN staff and team that participated and helped make this possible today. We really couldn't do this without the whole group of us working together and pulling in the same direction. It's one of the things that I think makes us great here at DTN. And I just want to take one more minute and reflect on what Greg Horstmeier said there. Please, everyone, have a safe, healthy, happy, Merry Christmas and a prosperous New Year. Take care.